Every day, over 100,000 flights take off and land safely. We trust that when we board a plane, we will arrive at our destination. But for some, that arrival never comes. Today, we are opening the case files on the 15 most mysterious aviation disappearances of all time. Some of these you might know, but others will make you think twice before booking your next flight. So subscribe to the channel, buckle up, and let's begin. San Francisco in August of 1942 wasn't just a city. It was the western edge of a war. The attack on Pearl Harbor was still fresh in everyone's mind, and the paranoia was thick enough to cut with a knife. Japanese submarines were out there, lurking just beneath the surface of the Pacific, and everyone knew it. Fishermen spotted periscopes, tankers got torpedoed, the Navy was scrambling. So as a result, the skies above the Golden Gate Bridge were constantly patrolled by these massive Navy blimps, dirigibles filled with helium, drifting slow and low over the water, hunting for enemy subs. It was tedious work, but it was critical. And on the morning of Sunday, August 16, 1942, two experienced officers climbed into the gondola of Navy blimp L-8 for what was supposed to be just another routine patrol. A milk run. Lieutenant Ernest Cody, 27 years old, Naval Academy graduate, described by his peers as cool, capable, the kind of guy who didn't rattle easily. And Ensign Charles Adams, a veteran with 20 years of lighter-than-air experience. He'd survived the crash of the USS Macon back in 1935. He'd been on the ground crew when the Hindenburg burned. This man had seen it all. So when these two climbed into that blimp at 6:03 in the morning, nobody was worried. They were professionals. The mission was simple. Fly out over the Farallon Islands, about 25 miles offshore, sweep the area for submarines, and come home. At 7:38 a.m., Lieutenant Cody radioed in. Everything was normal. They were 4 miles east of the Farallons. Operations normal. Then, at 7:42 a.m., the radio crackled again. Cody's voice came through calm and clear. "Am investigating suspicious oil slick. Stand by." An oil slick could be a leaking sub, could be nothing. But that was the last anyone ever heard from him. The scheduled position report at 8:50 a.m. Silence. Air traffic controllers tried to hail the L-8. Nothing. Just dead air. Apparently, two surface vessels, a Liberty ship and a fishing trawler, saw the blimp descending low over the oil slick around 8:00 a.m. The witnesses said it dropped to about 30 feet above the waves circling the slick. They saw smoke flares get dropped to mark the location, standard anti-submarine procedure. The crew was clearly active. Everything looked fine. But then the blimp suddenly shot upward, dumping ballast, climbing fast into the cloud deck at 2,500 feet, and it started drifting. East, back toward the coast, away from the patrol zone. Now, this is important. A Pan Am clipper flying inbound from the Pacific spotted the L-8 sitting on top of the clouds around 10:20 a.m. The pilot said it looked out of control, but they couldn't see inside the gondola. They couldn't confirm anything. At 11:15 in the morning, 5 hours after takeoff, the blimp came drifting in over Ocean Beach, sagging and low. Surfers and fishermen on the sand looked up and saw this massive gray shape descending toward them like some kind of wounded sky whale. It touched down on the beach. Two fishermen ran over and grabbed the mooring lines, trying to secure it. And that's when one of the depth charges, a 325-pound high explosive, broke loose and hit the sand. Fortunately, it didn't detonate, but the sudden loss of weight caused the blimp to shoot back up into the air, ripping the ropes out of the fishermen's hands. Furthermore, it drifted inland over the coastal hills, scraping across rooftops in Daly City. Telephone wires got tangled in the control car, and finally, at 11:30 a.m., the L-8 settled gently onto Bellevue Avenue, a quiet residential street, like a giant deflating balloon. Neighbors poured out of their houses, kids on bicycles, housewives in aprons. They all ran toward the blimp, expecting to help the crew out. The police arrived. They ran to the gondola and yanked the door open, ready to pull out two injured men. But the gondola was empty. The scene inside was pristine. The waxed deck was spotless, no blood, no signs of a struggle. The radio was switched on and functional. The engines were still in the on position, though they had stopped running. The parachutes, 2 of them, were sitting in their racks, neatly stowed. The life raft was in its compartment. The classified code books, top-secret documents that pilots are trained to destroy or take with them in an emergency, were sitting right there on the desk, untouched. The only thing missing was Lieutenant Cody and Ensign Adams. The Navy launched a massive search. Coast Guard cutters, aircraft, divers, they combed the ocean for days. They found nothing. No bodies, no uniforms, no trace of the men. So the official Navy conclusion? They said it was probably an accident. Maybe one of the men leaned out of the open door to get a better look at the oil slick, checking the engine or adjusting something on the outside of the gondola, and he slipped, fell into the ocean. And then the second man, realizing what happened, rushed to the door to try and save him, and he fell out too. The sudden loss of 350 to 400 pounds of human weight caused the blimp to become buoyant and shoot up into the clouds. Tragic, but explainable. But the case was far from closed, because if one man fell out, why didn't the other man immediately grab the radio and scream "Mayday"? The microphone was right there. The radio was working. These were trained naval officers. The first thing you do in an emergency is call for help. You don't just stand there and fall out the door yourself. And here's the thing. The door wasn't just open. It was latched open. The latch is a heavy metal mechanism. You have to physically engage it. You don't accidentally latch a door open while you're falling to your death. So who latched it, and why? Furthermore, if they were in distress, if they knew something was wrong, why didn't they put on the parachutes? The parachutes were right there. You strap them on. That's what they're for. But they didn't take them. Why not? And the life raft. If they were going into the water, even accidentally, why didn't they grab the life raft? It was in the gondola. It takes 2 seconds to throw it out the door, but it was still sitting there when the police opened the gondola. And the classified code books. Pilots are explicitly trained. If you're abandoning the aircraft, if you're going down, you destroy the codes or you take them with you. You do not leave them for the enemy to find. But Cody and Adams left them sitting on the desk like they were coming right back. So we're supposed to believe that 2 experienced officers, one of whom survived the Macon crash, one of whom was a Naval Academy graduate, both panicked, forgot their training, ignored the radio, ignored the parachutes, ignored the life raft, ignored the code books, and just fell out? And here's the kicker. This happened in broad daylight, on a clear Sunday morning. There were thousands of people on Ocean Beach. There were ships offshore. The Pan Am Clipper saw the blimp from above. If a Japanese submarine had surfaced and attacked them, if enemy sailors had climbed aboard and abducted the crew, someone would have seen it. The ocean was crawling with witnesses, but nobody saw anything. So what we have is a pristine airship that flew itself back to shore, landed gently on a suburban street, with the engines running, the radio working, the parachutes packed, and the door latched open. The only thing missing? 2 men who vanished into thin air. No distress call, no bodies, no wreckage, just an empty gondola and a whole lot of questions that the Navy never answered. Makes you wonder. There's this concept in maritime history called the ghost ship, a vessel found adrift at sea, sails set, cargo intact, but the crew is just gone. The Mary Celeste, the Carol A. Deering. Ships that kept sailing long after the people inside had ceased to function. It's one of the oldest mysteries in the book. But here's the thing. In the modern age, we don't have ghost ships anymore. We have ghost flights. And this is significant because a plane on autopilot can do something a sailing ship never could. It can fly with perfect precision, following waypoints, maintaining altitude, circling a city for hours, all while carrying a cabin full of people who are already dead. On August 14, 2005, the skies over the Mediterranean were flawless. It was a warm summer morning in Cyprus, the kind of day you dream about for a beach vacation. Families were boarding Helios Airways Flight 522 at Larnaca International Airport, heading to Athens, a short hop across the water, an hour and 15 minutes, tops. Parents with kids, tourists with cameras. It was supposed to be easy. The aircraft was a Boeing 737, one of the most reliable, most common planes in the sky. Pilots call it a workhorse. It's been flying passengers safely for decades. If you've ever been on a commercial flight, you've probably been on a 737. So when Flight 522 taxied down the runway that morning, nobody was worried. The plane took off at 9:07 a.m. local time. Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten and First Officer Pampos Charalambous were at the controls. The flight climbed smoothly to cruising altitude, 34,000 feet, and turned northwest toward Athens. But very quickly, something went wrong. Air traffic control in Cyprus tried to contact the flight. No response. They tried again. Silence. The plane wasn't answering. Controllers assumed it was a radio malfunction, annoying but not unusual. So they watched the radar blip and waited for the crew to switch frequencies and check in with Athens. But the plane never checked in. Apparently, Flight 522 reached the Athens control zone right on schedule. But instead of descending for landing, it just kept flying. It reached the programmed waypoint, a navigational fix called the KEA VOR, and then did something eerie. It entered a holding pattern. The autopilot kicked in, and the plane started circling the city, round and round, like it was waiting for permission to land. But there was no one awake to request it. Now, this is important. It's 2005. The world is still on edge after 9/11. When a commercial airliner stops responding to air traffic control and starts circling a major European capital, alarm bells go off. The Greek military assumes the worst: hijacking, terrorism, a deliberate attack. So as a result, they scramble 2 F-16 fighter jets from Tanagra Air Base with a simple order: intercept the 737, make visual contact, and if necessary, shoot it down. At 11:24 a.m., more than 2 hours after takeoff, the F-16s pull up alongside Flight 522 at 34,000 feet. The fighter pilots throttle back, matching speed with the airliner. They're close enough to see through the cockpit windows. And what they see, it's something they'll never forget. The captain's seat is empty, just vacant. No one is flying the plane. The first officer is slumped forward over the controls, motionless. His head is tilted to the side. He's not moving. He's not breathing. He's dead. The fighter pilot radios back to command. The captain is not in his seat. The first officer appears to be incapacitated. Furthermore, they can see into the cabin through the windows. Oxygen masks are dangling from the ceiling, those yellow drop-down masks you're told about in the safety briefing. But the passengers aren't wearing them. They're just sitting there, frozen in their seats. Some are slumped over, some have their heads tilted back. None of them are moving. It's a flying tomb. The fighter pilots are circling this ghost ship in the sky, watching it fly itself in perfect loops over Athens. And there's nothing they can do. They can't land it. They can't wake anyone up. They can only watch. And then, suddenly, there's movement. At 11:49 a.m., a man appears in the cockpit doorway. He's not wearing a pilot's uniform. He's wearing the blue shirt of a flight attendant. His name is Andreas Prodromou. He's 25 years old, and he's barely conscious. Apparently, Prodromou had a commercial pilot's license. He wasn't qualified to fly a 737, but he knew the basics. He'd been in the cabin when everyone started passing out, and he grabbed one of the portable oxygen bottles, the kind the flight attendants use. It kept him alive just long enough to stumble into the cockpit. The F-16 pilot watches as Prodromou waves weakly at him through the window. He's trying to communicate. He's trying to save the plane. He reaches for the controls, fumbling with the autopilot disconnect, but he's weak. Hypoxia has been eating his brain for 2 hours. His movements are slow, clumsy. He doesn't know which buttons to push. He's running out of time. At 11:49 a.m., the left engine flames out. The fuel is gone. The plane has been circling for so long that the tanks are dry. 10 minutes later, 12:04 p.m., the right engine dies. The autopilot tries to compensate. But without thrust, the laws of physics take over. The nose drops. The plane banks hard to the left and begins a steep, spiraling descent toward the Grammatico Hills, 25 miles north of Athens. At 12:04 p.m., Flight 522 impacts the ground at high speed. The explosion is massive. The wreckage is scattered across a hillside olive grove. All 121 people on board, 115 passengers and 6 crew, are gone. So the investigation begins. And the official story goes like this. The night before the flight, ground engineers in Cyprus were troubleshooting a problem with the cabin door seals. To test the pressurization system, they flipped a switch on the overhead panel to manual mode. When they finished the test, they forgot to flip it back to auto. So as a result, when the plane took off the next morning, the pressurization system didn't activate. The cabin altitude started climbing. By the time the plane reached 12,000 feet, the air inside was too thin to breathe. By 14,000 feet, the passengers were passing out. The pilots, already suffering from hypoxia, became confused, disoriented. They heard a loud warning horn blaring in the cockpit, but they thought it was a takeoff configuration error. They didn't realize they were suffocating. They lost consciousness. The plane kept flying on autopilot. Everyone died. However, the investigation was far from over. Because here's the first problem. How do two experienced pilots miss a critical switch during the pre-flight checklist? The pressurization panel is right there on the overhead console. It's item 1 on the checklist. You're supposed to visually confirm it's set to auto before you even start the engines. Captain Merton had thousands of flight hours. First Officer Charalambous was a seasoned pilot. How do both of them miss it? And here's the second problem, the one that makes my blood boil. When the cabin altitude got too high, a loud horn started blaring in the cockpit. This horn is supposed to warn the pilots, "You are about to die. Descend immediately." It's the most important alarm on the plane, but on the Boeing 737, that horn sounds exactly the same as the takeoff configuration warning, the alarm that goes off on the ground if you forget to set the flaps. Same sound, same volume, same everything. So when the pilots heard it in mid-flight, already hypoxic, already confused, they assumed it was a minor glitch. They thought the plane was nagging them about a flap setting while they were at 34,000 feet. Why would anyone design a plane like that? Why would the "you're about to die" alarm sound identical to the "you forgot to adjust the flaps" alarm? It's insane. Furthermore, the ground engineers who left the switch in manual mode, they were never prosecuted. The airline's maintenance protocols were never seriously questioned. The blame landed squarely on the dead pilots, 2 men who couldn't defend themselves. But here's the thing. Boeing knew this was a problem. There had been incidents before, planes that lost pressurization because the switch was left in manual. Boeing issued bulletins. Airlines were supposed to add extra checks to the pre-flight procedure, but Helios Airways didn't implement them. The switch was still easy to miss. The alarm was still confusing, and 121 people paid the price. So what we have is a plane that circled Athens for 2 hours, carrying 121 people who were already asleep, already slipping into an irreversible coma, while the autopilot flew perfect loops over the city. The Greek military watched it happen. The F-16 pilots looked into the cockpit and saw a dead man at the controls and a flight attendant trying desperately to save a plane he didn't know how to fly. And when it was over, when the wreckage was scattered across that hillside, the official report blamed the pilots. Not the engineers who left the switch, not the airline that ignored the safety bulletins, not Boeing, who designed an alarm system that sounded the same for a minor error as it did for a catastrophic emergency. The image of that 737 circling endlessly above Athens, a machine doing its job perfectly while everyone inside was already gone, it's the modern ghost ship. Except this one didn't drift across the ocean for months. It only took 2 hours. Makes you wonder. The Calancio Sand Sea in Libya is not a place you want to be. It's an ocean of fire, endless dunes of sand that shift and shimmer in waves of heat so intense they distort the horizon. Temperatures during the day can hit 130 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, it plummets to freezing. There's no water, no vegetation, no landmarks, just sand, stretching in every direction for hundreds of miles. But here's the thing about the Sahara, it's so dry, so hostile to life, that nothing rots. If you die there, you stay there. Bodies mummify. Metal doesn't rust. A plane crash in the desert becomes a time capsule, frozen in the moment of impact. And this is significant because in 1943, a massive American bomber disappeared into that sea of sand, and no one found it for 15 years. April 4th, 1943, Soluch Airfield near Benghazi, Libya. It's the height of World War II, and the North African campaign is in full swing. The airfield is home to the 376th Bomb Group, B-24 Liberator heavy bombers, built to pound German and Italian targets across the Mediterranean. On this particular morning, the 514th Bomb Squadron is preparing for a mission, a bombing run over Naples, Italy. The target is the harbor. The goal is to disrupt Axis shipping. It's a dangerous mission, long range over open water with the threat of enemy fighters and flak. But for the crew of one particular B-24, it's their very first combat sortie. The plane's name is the Lady Be Good, serial number 4124301. It's a brand new bomber, fresh from the factory. And the crew, 9 young men, Lieutenant William Hatton, the pilot, Second Lieutenant Robert Toner, the co-pilot, and 7 others, all on their first mission. They're rookies, nervous, eager, ready to prove themselves. So as a result, when the mission launches, the Lady Be Good takes off into a blinding sandstorm. The visibility is so bad that 9 other bombers aboard immediately, engines clogging with sand, pilots unable to see the runway. But the crew of the Lady Be Good pushes forward. They separate from the formation, flying solo through the storm, and somehow make it across the Mediterranean to Naples. But when they arrive, the target is obscured by heavy cloud cover. They can't see the harbor, they can't drop their bombs, so they jettison the payload into the sea and turn back toward Libya. It's late afternoon, the sun is setting, and they're about to make a mistake that will haunt history. The return flight is conducted in pitch darkness. The crew is flying above a solid cloud deck, no visibility, no reference points. They're relying entirely on dead reckoning, calculating their position based on airspeed, elapsed time, and estimated wind. But what they don't know, what they can't know, is that a massive tailwind is pushing them from behind. A jet stream. It's shoving the plane forward much faster than their instruments indicate. Apparently, the radio direction finder, the ADF, which is supposed to guide them back to the base, starts malfunctioning. It gives them a reciprocal reading, pointing them in the wrong direction. Lieutenant Hatton, the pilot, radios back to Benina Airfield. "My ADF has malfunctioned. Please, give me a QDM." He's asking for a magnetic bearing, a heading to fly to get back home. The base responds. They tell him to fly 330 degrees, back toward the coast. They fire flares into the sky to mark the airfield, but the flares are swallowed by the clouds. Hatton never sees them, and the radio message is garbled by static. He's not sure if he heard it correctly. Now, this is important. The crew thinks they're still over the Mediterranean Sea, approaching the Libyan coast. In their minds, they've been flying for the right amount of time. They should be close to base, but the tailwind has been pushing them so fast that they've already crossed the coastline without knowing it. They flew right over Benina Airfield in the dark, hidden by the clouds, and kept going. By midnight, the fuel gauges are dropping. They're flying on fumes. And still, all they see below them is darkness. No city lights, no flares, nothing. Hatton assumes they're over the ocean, just offshore, searching for the base. He doesn't realize they're 400 miles inland, deep in the Sahara Desert. At 2 a.m., the fuel situation becomes critical. Hatton makes the call. "We're bailing out." He orders the crew to grab their parachutes and jump. They think they're jumping into the Mediterranean, into the water where they can swim to shore or be picked up by rescue boats. It's a terrifying decision, but it's the right call if you're over water. But they're not over water. They're over the desert. So as a result, 9 men jump out of the Lady Be Good at 2 a.m. into pitch-black emptiness. The bombardier, John Moravka, goes first. His parachute malfunctions. He falls 10,000 feet and hits the sand at terminal velocity. He dies instantly. The other 8 men land safely in the dunes. They unbuckle their chutes, call out to each other in the darkness, and regroup. They're alive. They think they're near the coast. They think rescue is coming. And the plane, the Lady Be Good, now lighter without the crew, stabilizes. It glides down on one engine, and in a stroke of aerodynamic luck, it performs a gentle belly landing on the flat, hard sand of the Colancio Sand Sea. The fuselage breaks in two, but the plane remains largely intact. The landing gear is sheared off, but the structure is sound. The Lady Be Good has landed itself. 15 years pass. The war ends. The desert reclaims the land, and the Lady Be Good sits alone in the sand, undiscovered, like a ghost. In 1958, a team of British petroleum oil geologists is flying a survey mission over the Colancio Sand Sea. They're looking for potential drilling sites, and as they fly over one of the most desolate, uninhabited stretches of desert on the planet, they see something impossible. A plane, a pinkish shape sitting in the sand, perfectly preserved. They circle lower. They radio back to base. They can't believe what they're seeing. It's a B-24 Liberator, an American bomber from World War II, and it looks like it crashed yesterday. Furthermore, when the ground team arrives, they find something even more unbelievable. The Lady Be Good is in pristine condition. The dry desert air has mummified it. There's no rust, no rot. The machine guns are still functional. The radio still works. They turn it on and it powers up. There's a thermos of coffee sitting in the cabin. They open it. The coffee is still liquid, after 15 years. But the plane is empty. There's no crew, no bodies, just an immaculate aircraft sitting in the middle of nowhere. So the search expands. If the plane is here, where are the men? In 1960, a ground expedition traces their path. They find the crew's final march preserved in the sand like a trail of breadcrumbs. Apparently, after the 8 survivors regrouped on the night of the bailout, they decided to walk north. They thought the coast was close, maybe 20-30 miles. They thought they'd see the Mediterranean by sunrise, so they started walking. But the Mediterranean was 400 miles away. They were walking deeper into the desert. The searchers find the parachutes laid out in patterns, arrows made of stones and fabric pointing north. The crew was trying to guide rescue planes to their location, but no one was looking for them in the Sahara. Everyone assumed they'd crashed into the sea. Furthermore, they find the bodies, or what's left of them. Mummified remains scattered across 85 miles of desert, and here's where it gets heartbreaking. They also find the diaries. Second Lieutenant Robert Toner kept a journal. The entries are scrawled in pencil, shaky handwriting. They detail the suffering. Sunday, April 11th. Still waiting for help, still praying. Eyes bad, lost all our weight, all want to die. The entries stop on April 12th, 8 days after the bailout. The crew had walked 85 miles with almost no water. Survival experts say that's physically impossible. A human being in that heat with no water should collapse after 20 miles, maybe 30 if they're lucky. But these men walked 85 miles. They walked for 8 days. What kept them going? And here's the cruel irony. If they had walked south instead of north, if they had turned around, they would have found the plane. The Lady Be Good was sitting there, intact, with water canteens on board, with a working radio, with emergency rations. If they had just stayed with the plane, if they had radioed for help, they would have survived. But they didn't know. They thought the plane had crashed miles away. So they walked away from their only salvation. But the mystery refused to be solved so simply. Because here's the question that haunts me. How does a trained navigator miss his target by 400 miles? That's not a small error. That's flying across an entire country by mistake. The crew of the Lady Be Good had maps, compasses, a sextant for celestial navigation. And yet they ended up so far off course, that they didn't even realize they'd crossed the coastline. How does that happen? And furthermore, the plane landed so gently, so perfectly, that if the crew had just sat down and strapped in, they would have survived the crash. The fuselage was intact, the radio worked, the food was edible, but they jumped because they thought they were over water. They made the rational decision based on faulty information, and it killed them. So what we have is a plane that survived its crew. The Lady Be Good sat alone in the desert for 15 years, waiting for a crew that had already died, walking in the opposite direction. And when they finally found the men, when they traced their final steps across 85 miles of hell, they realized these guys had come within 30 miles of the plane before collapsing. If they had just turned around, if they had just known. The wreckage was eventually recovered. Parts of the Lady Be Good are on display in museums now, but some of the salvaged parts were installed in other planes, and apparently, pilots started reporting strange malfunctions, radios cutting out, instruments failing. They called it the Lady Be Good curse. Superstition? Maybe. But the mechanics eventually removed the parts and the problem stopped. The image of that bomber sitting alone in the sand, its radio waiting to be turned on, its water waiting to be drunk, while 9 men walked away from it into the void. It's one of the cruelest ironies in aviation history. Makes you wonder. There's this idea in folklore that you can't cheat death. You might dodge it once, walk away from the car crash, survive the fire, beat the odds. But eventually, death comes back for what it's owed. And this is significant because in 1979, a man who thought he'd already paid his dues learned that the universe keeps a ledger. His name was Captain Gilberto Araujo da Silva. He was 55 years old, a Brazilian pilot with Varig Airlines, and he was a legend in the aviation world, not because of how many hours he'd logged or how many countries he'd flown to, but because of what happened on July 11, 1973. On that day, Captain Gilberto was flying Varig Flight 820 from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. It was a Boeing 707 filled with passengers, families, business people, tourists. And somewhere over the Atlantic, a fire broke out in the rear lavatory. Smoke filled the cabin. People were screaming. The plane was burning from the inside out. But Captain Gilberto didn't panic. He declared an emergency, descended through the clouds, and spotted a small airfield near Orly, just outside Paris. He lined up the burning plane with a field of onions next to the runway and crash-landed it. The fuselage split open. Fire engulfed the wreckage. Out of 134 people on board, 123 died. But 11 people survived, and Captain Gilberto was one of them. He walked away from that inferno with burns and smoke inhalation, but he was alive. He was hailed as a hero. The man who brought a burning plane down and lived to tell the story. He thought he was the luckiest man alive. He was wrong. January 30th, 1979. Narita International Airport, Tokyo. It's a cold winter night and the tarmac is quiet. Most of the passenger flights have already departed, but sitting at the far end of the runway is a Boeing 707, not a passenger jet, but a cargo freighter. Varig Flight 967, registration PPVLU. Now, this is important. This wasn't just any cargo flight. Inside the belly of that 707 were 153 paintings by Manabu Mabe, a famous Japanese-Brazilian artist. The collection had just finished a prestigious exhibition in Tokyo, and now it was being flown back to Brazil. The paintings were insured for $124 million, a fortune in 1979. That's nearly $5 million in today's money. So as a result, the cargo hold of Flight 967 was essentially a flying art gallery. Crated masterpieces stacked carefully in the fuselage, along with general freight, industrial goods, electronics, the usual stuff. And at the controls, Captain Gilberto Araujo da Silva, the survivor, the hero of Paris. He and his crew of 5 prepared for a long-haul flight, Tokyo to Los Angeles, then down to Sao Paulo, Brazil, a routine cargo run. At 8:23 p.m. local time, Flight 967 rolled down the runway and lifted off into the dark winter sky over the Pacific. The plane climbed to cruising altitude, 35,000 feet, and turned east, heading out over the vast empty ocean. At 8:45 p.m., just 22 minutes after takeoff, the crew radios in their first position report they're 200 kilometers, about 120 miles, east-northeast of Tokyo. Everything is normal, weather is clear, systems are functioning, the transmission is calm, routine, no signs of trouble. Apparently, the next mandatory position check is scheduled for 9:23 p.m. Controllers in Tokyo wait. The clock ticks past 9:23. No call. They wait a few more minutes, assuming the crew is busy or adjusting frequencies. Still nothing. They try to hail Flight 967 on the radio. No response. They try again. Silence. Furthermore, there's no distress signal, no Mayday, no SOS, no emergency transponder beacon. The radar shows the plane's blip fading as it moves out of range, and then it's just gone. The frequency is dead. Flight 967 has ceased to exist. At first, controllers assume it's a radio malfunction. Planes don't just vanish in 1979. We have radar, satellites, navigation beacons. But as the hours tick by and the silence continues, the reality sets in. Something is very, very wrong. The alert goes out. The U.S. Coast Guard, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, and the U.S. Navy launch one of the largest search operations in Pacific history. Ships and aircraft scour the ocean for 8 days straight. They cover thousands of square miles, sweeping back and forth along the flight path, searching for wreckage. Now, here's the thing. A Boeing 707 is a massive aircraft. It weighs over 150 tons when fully loaded. Even if it hits the water at high speed, even if it disintegrates on impact, things float. Seat cushions, cargo boxes, tires, oil, insulation, life rafts. There's always something. Aviation investigators know this. Every crash in history leaves a debris field, but Flight 967, they find nothing. No oil slick, no floating wreckage, no bodies, not a single screw. It's as if the plane was swallowed whole by the Pacific and never spit back out. Apparently, the search teams are baffled. The weather was clear. The plane was in perfect working order. There was no mechanical issue reported. And yet, 30 minutes after a routine position check, a 707 cargo jet with 6 people on board just disappears. So the official theory goes like this: a catastrophic depressurization event. Maybe a cargo door blew out, maybe the fuselage cracked. The cabin lost pressure instantly, and the crew was incapacitated by hypoxia, lack of oxygen. They passed out. The plane, still on autopilot, continued flying east into the Pacific until it ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean thousands of miles from the search zone. That's why no wreckage was found. The plane went down in the middle of nowhere, and the debris sank in water so deep it'll never be recovered. The end. But not so fast. Because here's the first problem. If the plane flew on autopilot for hours until it ran out of fuel, it would have crashed way beyond the search area. But the Pacific is littered with shipping lanes, fishing fleets, and island nations. In the 45 years since 1979, not a single piece of wreckage has ever washed up. Not on a beach in Hawaii, not on a reef in the Philippines, not on the coast of California. Nothing. Zero. That's statistically improbable for a crash at sea. And here's the second problem: the cargo. Is it really a coincidence that the one plane that vanishes without a trace just happens to be carrying $124 million in artwork? Some investigators, particularly in Brazil, believe this wasn't a crash. They think it was a heist. The theory goes like this: someone on the crew was in on it. Maybe the plane didn't crash. Maybe it diverted to a remote airstrip, somewhere in the Soviet Far East, or a hidden runway in the Pacific Islands. The paintings were offloaded, the plane was scuttled, and the crew disappeared with new identities. Furthermore, there's the Cold War angle. It's 1979. The Soviet Union is still a superpower. The Pacific is a hotbed of espionage. And apparently, there are persistent, though unverified, rumors that Flight 967 wasn't just carrying paintings. Some conspiracy theorists claim the cargo manifest was a cover, and the plane was secretly transporting something the Soviets wanted: dismantled fighter jet parts, classified electronics, maybe even nuclear material. Did Soviet agents intercept the flight? Did they force it to land in Siberia? There's no proof of any of this. But here's what we do know. Captain Gilberto Araujo da Silva, the man who survived a fire in the sky over Paris, the man who landed a burning 707 in a field of onions and walked away, vanished over the Pacific without a single word. No distress call, no final transmission. Just silence. And here's the kicker. The 133 paintings by Manabu Mabe, they were insured for over $1 million. But they've never surfaced, not on the black market, not in private collections, not in a Soviet warehouse. If this was a heist, the thieves never cashed in. If this was a crash, the ocean never gave anything back. So what we have is a man who cheated death once, who walked out of a burning plane in 1973 and became a legend, only to vanish 6 years later into the cold, dark waters of the Pacific. No wreckage, no bodies, no answers. Just a Boeing 707 and 6 souls erased from existence. Some people say the ocean collects its debts, that if you escape death once, it comes back for you. Captain Gilberto survived the fire, but the ice got him in the end. And the paintings? Those masterpieces, 153 works of art carefully crated and insured, are listed as lost. Gone. Somewhere at the bottom of the Pacific, or hanging on a wall in a hidden vault that we'll never find. Makes you wonder. The Bass Strait. It's the stretch of water that separates mainland Australia from Tasmania. About 150 miles of cold, choppy ocean notorious for violent weather and unpredictable currents. Sailors call it the Triangle of the South. It has a reputation. Ships vanish, planes go down. It's been swallowing vessels for over a century. And this is significant because on the evening of October 21, 1978, a 20-year-old pilot named Frederick Valentich wasn't flying over calm, friendly skies. He was flying over a graveyard. Frederick was an enthusiastic guy. He loved flying. He'd gotten his pilot's license young and was working toward his commercial rating. But here's the thing. He wasn't a great pilot. He'd failed his exams twice. He'd gotten lost before, strayed into controlled airspace, minor infractions, nothing catastrophic, but enough to show he was still learning. He had about 150 hours of flight time under his belt, not a ton, but enough to fly solo at night under visual flight rules. On that Saturday evening, Frederick filed a flight plan at Moorabbin Airport in Melbourne. He was flying a single-engine Cessna 182, registration VHDSJ. The plan was simple: fly south across the Bass Strait to King Island, pick up some friends, and fly back. Or maybe he was picking up crayfish. The story changed depending on who you asked. Either way, it was supposed to be a short, easy hop, about an hour each way. Now, this is important. The weather was perfect. Crystal clear skies, no wind, unlimited visibility, the kind of night where you can see the stars so clearly it feels like you're flying through space. Venus and Mars were especially bright that evening, shining like beacons on the horizon. It was a textbook perfect night for flying. So as a result, Frederick climbed into the Cessna at 6:19 p.m., fired up the engine, and took off into the twilight. He climbed to 4,500 feet, leveled off, and headed south over the Bass Strait. The sun was setting behind him, painting the ocean below in shades of orange and purple. He was alone in the cockpit, the hum of the engine steady, the radio crackling softly in his headset. And for the first 47 minutes, everything was fine. At 7:06 p.m., Frederick keys the mic and calls Melbourne Flight Service. The controller on duty is a guy named Steve Roby. The exchange starts calm, routine. Frederick: Melbourne, this is Delta Sierra Juliet. Is there any known traffic below 5,000? Steve Roby: Delta Sierra Juliet, no known traffic. Frederick pauses, then his voice comes back, and there's an edge to it now. Confusion, maybe a little unease. Frederick: Melbourne, It seems to me that there's a large aircraft below 5,000. Roby: What type of aircraft is it? Frederick: I cannot affirm. It's four bright, it seems to me like landing lights. Apparently, Frederick is staring at something big, something with four bright lights. He watches it for a few seconds, then adds, Frederick: The aircraft has just passed over me at least 1,000 feet above. Roby: Delta Sierra Juliet, roger. And it is a large aircraft? Confirm. Frederick: Unknown due to the speed it's traveling. Is there any Air Force aircraft in the vicinity? Roby: No known aircraft in the vicinity. Now, this is where it gets strange. Frederick goes quiet for a moment, and then his voice comes back, faster now, more agitated. Frederick: Melbourne, it's approaching now from due east toward me. Silence. Then, Frederick: It seems to me that he's playing some sort of game. He's flying over me 2-3 times at speeds I could not identify. Furthermore, he's not just seeing lights anymore. He's describing behavior. This thing, whatever it is circling him, orbiting his plane, and it's fast. Faster than anything he's ever seen. Roby: Delta Sierra Juliet, what is your actual level? Frederick: My level is 4,500, 4500. Roby: And you confirm you cannot identify the aircraft? Frederick: Affirmative. Roby: Roger, stand by. And then Frederick says something that changes the tone completely. Frederick: Melbourne, Delta Sierra Juliet. It's not an aircraft, it is. He stops mid-sentence. The mic clicks off. A few seconds pass. Then he keys the mic again, and his voice is different now, strained, almost breathless. Frederick: Melbourne, it's got a green light and sort of metallic-like. It's all shiny on the outside. A green light, a metallic surface. This isn't a Cessna or a commercial jet or a military plane. This is something else. Roby: Delta Sierra Juliet. Frederick: It just vanished. Roby: Confirm it has vanished. Frederick: Say again. Roby: Is the aircraft still with you? Frederick: It's now approaching from the southwest. So as a result, this thing is playing with him. It disappears and reappears. It's circling, it's stalking. And then Frederick's engine starts acting up. Frederick: The engine is rough idling. I've got it set at 23-24, and the thing is coughing. Roby: Delta Sierra Juliet, roger. What are your intentions? Frederick: My intentions are, to go to King Island. Melbourne, that strange aircraft is hovering on top of me again. He pauses. You can hear the tension in his voice now. He's scared. Frederick: It is hovering, and it's not an aircraft. And then, 17 seconds of sound, not words, not static. Something else. A metallic scraping, grinding noise, like metal dragging against metal, or interference, or something mechanical. And then, silence. That was the last anyone ever heard from Frederick Valentich. The radio went dead. The plane vanished from radar. At 7:12 p.m., 47 minutes into the flight, Frederick and his Cessna 182 ceased to exist. Apparently, the Royal Australian Air Force launched a massive search operation. They sent planes and ships out to scour the Bass Strait. They searched for 4 days. They found nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no life raft, no body. The Cessna 182 was just gone. 5 years later, in 1983, a piece of a cowl flap, part of an engine, washed up on Flinders Island. Some people claimed it was from a Cessna 182. The Bureau of Air Safety Investigation examined it, but couldn't definitively link it to Frederick's plane. It might have been his. It might not. We'll never know. So the official explanation from the Australian government is this: spatial disorientation. Frederick was a relatively inexperienced pilot flying at night over open water. He became disoriented, lost his sense of up and down. He accidentally flew upside down, saw the reflection of his own landing lights in the water, and mistook them for another aircraft. The bright planet Venus was also visible that night, and he confused it for a UFO. He spiraled into the ocean in confusion and crashed. Tragic, but explainable. Yet, the real answers lay buried much deeper. Because here's the first problem. If Frederick was flying upside down, he would have known. Spatial disorientation doesn't turn off your sense of gravity. The blood would rush to his head. The instruments would scream at him. The attitude indicator would show him upside down. The altimeter would be dropping. And most importantly, the engine would stall instantly. The Cessna 182 uses a gravity-fed fuel system. If you flip it upside down, the fuel can't reach the engine. It dies. But Frederick's engine didn't die until the very end. It was rough idling, which means it was still running. And here's the second problem: the description. Frederick didn't say, "I see some lights." He said, "It's got a green light and sort of metallic-like. It's all shiny on the outside." He described a physical object, a craft, with a surface, with a shape. Can a reflection of Venus orbit you? Can a reflection fly over you at high speed? Furthermore, there's the Roy Manifold photo. Roy Manifold was a plumber. On the evening of October 21, 1978, he was standing on the coast near Cape Otway taking photos of the sunset. He snapped a picture at 6:47 p.m., right around the time Frederick would have been flying overhead. When the photo was developed, it showed something strange. A dark, elongated blur rising out of the water, trailing some kind of exhaust or vapor. NASA analysts examined the photo years later. They couldn't explain it. They couldn't debunk it. It's just there. And then there's the sound. That 17-second metallic scraping noise on the open mic. Go listen to it. It's publicly available. That is not the sound of a plane hitting water. That is not the sound of an engine failing. It's something else. Interference, a signal disruption. Something mechanical, but not from the Cessna. Frederick Valentich's father, Guido, spent the rest of his life believing his son wasn't dead. He believed Frederick was taken, not crashed, not killed, taken. He gave interviews, he wrote letters, he never stopped searching for answers. And when he died without closure. Apparently, in 2014, a researcher claimed to have found wreckage on the ocean floor using sonar, but the Australian government never confirmed it. The case is still officially listed as missing and unexplained. So what we have is a 20-year-old pilot who took off into a perfect October sky and encountered something over the Bass Strait that he couldn't identify. He described it in detail. He reported its movements. He said it was hovering over him. He said, "It's not an aircraft." And then he vanished without a trace. No wreckage, no body, no answers. Just a 6-minute audio recording of a terrified young man describing something that, according to the official story, doesn't exist. The ocean keeps its secrets, the sky keeps its silence. Makes you wonder. November 23, 1953. The Cold War isn't just cold, it's freezing hot. The Soviet Union has the atomic bomb. Stalin just died earlier that year, and nobody knows what the new Soviet leadership is planning. The United States is on edge. Every radar blip is a potential threat. Every unidentified aircraft could be the opening move of World War III. And this is significant because Kinross Air Force Base in Michigan's Upper Peninsula isn't just some random military installation. It sits right next to the Sulaks, the Sault Ste. Marie shipping canals. Those locks are the most strategically important waterway in the United States. They connect Lake Superior to the lower Great Lakes, and through them flows nearly all of the iron ore used to make American steel. Tanks, battleships, fighter jets, all of it starts at the Sulaks. So as a result, the Air Force wasn't just protecting empty sky. They were guarding the jugular vein of the American war machine. And on the night of November 23, 1953, something violated that airspace. It's evening. A storm is rolling across Lake Superior. Heavy snow, low visibility, turbulence. The kind of night where smart pilots stay on the ground. But at the Ground Control Intercept Station, call sign Pillow, radar operators are staring at their scopes when they see it. An unidentified target. No transponder, no flight plan. Just a blip on the screen, moving at approximately 500 miles per hour, 160 miles northwest of the Sulaks. The operators try to hail it on the radio. No response. They watch it for a few minutes, hoping it'll identify itself. It doesn't, and it's heading toward restricted airspace, so the order comes down: scramble an interceptor. Apparently, earlier that same day, another F-89 Scorpion from a nearby base had exploded mid-air due to a mechanical failure, killing both crew members. The pilots at Kinross knew about it. They'd just lost friends. The atmosphere in the ready room was heavy. But when the klaxon sounded at 6:22 p.m., First Lieutenant Felix Eugene "Gene" Moncla Jr. and Second Lieutenant Robert L. Wilson didn't hesitate. They ran to their jet, the F-89 Scorpion. It's a twin-engine, all-weather interceptor, a beast of a plane, designed to hunt Soviet bombers in the dark. It's got radar in the nose, a two-man crew, and enough firepower to blow a bomber out of the sky. Moncla climbs into the pilot's seat. Wilson, the radar observer, climbs into the back. They can't see each other. Wilson is buried in the fuselage, staring at a glowing radar scope, guiding Moncla through the storm. At 6:22 p.m., the F-89 roars down the runway and punches up through the snow squalls into the black November sky. Picture the scene inside the ground control room. It's a dark, cramped space lit only by the green glow of radar screens. Controllers are wearing headsets, watching the scopes, guiding Moncla through the storm. They can't see the planes, they can only see the blips, little dots of light crawling across the glass. The unknown target is holding steady at about 8,000 feet, moving northwest. Moncla's F-89 climbs to 30,000 feet initially, then descends to intercept. The controller's voice crackles in Moncla's headset. "Avenger Red, your target is at your 11 o'clock, 10 miles. Moncla acknowledges. He banks the jet, throttles up, and starts closing the gap. He's doing 500 miles per hour through a snowstorm, flying on instruments, chasing a target he can't see. Wilson in the back is trying to lock onto the unknown with his radar, but he's struggling. The signal keeps fading, so Moncla is relying entirely on ground control to guide him in. Now, this is important. On the radar screen at Pillow Station, there are two blips. One is Moncla's F-89, marked friendly. The other is the unknown. The controller watches as the distance between them shrinks. 10 miles, 8 miles, 5 miles, 3 miles. Furthermore, Moncla radios in at 6:52 p.m. He reports he's entering rough air, turbulence from the storm. The controller acknowledges, and then, at 6:55 p.m., the two blips on the radar screen get very, very close. The controller is watching. He sees Moncla's blip moving toward the unknown at high speed. Standard procedure for an intercept is this: the fighter closes in, pulls alongside the target, identifies it visually, and either escorts it out of the airspace or, if it's hostile, engages. The two blips should merge briefly, indicating a flyby, and then separate. But that's not what happens. The two blips merge. They become one single return on the radar screen. The controller waits for them to separate. Seconds pass, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. They're still merged. And then, the single blip just fades. It disappears from the screen entirely. The controller tries to hail Moncla. "Avenger Red, do you read?" Nothing. He tries again. "Avenger Red, report your position." Silence. The radio is dead. The radar is empty. The F-89 Scorpion and the unknown target are both gone. The alarm goes out immediately. Search and rescue teams are mobilized. The U.S. Coast Guard, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and the U.S. Navy launch one of the largest searches in Great Lakes history. Ships crisscross Lake Superior. Aircraft fly grid patterns over the last known coordinates. They search for days. Apparently, the weather clears. The snow stops, the water calms, and they're looking for wreckage. Because here's the thing. If two aircraft collide at 500 miles per hour, they don't just disappear. They explode. Metal tears apart. Fuel ignites. Debris rains down over miles of water. You get an oil slick. You get floating wreckage, seats, tires, pieces of fuselage. You get bodies in life vests. There's always something. But the search teams find nothing. No oil slick, no wreckage, no bodies, not a single screw from the F-89 Scorpion. It's as if Moncla and Wilson and their 150-ton jet were erased from existence. Furthermore, there's a weird detail. A second F-89 had been scrambled to help search for Moncla, call sign Avenger Black, piloted by Second Lieutenant William Mingenbach. About 40 minutes after Moncla vanished from radar, Mingenbach later testified that he heard a brief fragmented transmission on the tactical frequency. He recognized the voice. It was Moncla's distinctive southern drawl. The voice said, "I think we better," and then cut out. If that testimony is accurate, it means Moncla was alive and trying to communicate nearly an hour after he disappeared from the radar screen. But the ground controllers never heard him, and no one ever heard from him again. So the Air Force releases their explanation. Actually, they release two explanations, which is already suspicious. First, they say Moncla probably suffered vertigo, spatial disorientation in the storm, and crashed into Lake Superior. Tragic, but explainable. Pilot error. Then, later, they change the story. They say the unknown target was actually a Royal Canadian Air Force C-47 Dakota transport plane, Flight VC-92, that had accidentally strayed off course into U.S. airspace. Moncla intercepted it, identified it, and then crashed into the lake on his way back to base, but the case was far from closed. Because here's the first problem. The Canadian government denied it. They said there was no RCAF C-47 in that area at that time. The pilot allegedly involved, a guy named Gerald Fosberg, said years later that he was nowhere near Lake Superior that night. He never saw an F-89. He never had an intercept. The Air Force's story doesn't match the Canadian records, and here's the second problem: the speed. The unknown target was tracked at 500 miles per hour. A C-47 Dakota is a propeller-driven transport plane. Its maximum speed is about 230 mph, and it cruises at around 160 mph. There is no way a radar operator mistakes a slow, lumbering transport for a high-speed, jet-level target. Moncla was flying 500 millimeters to catch this thing. You don't need to fly that fast to intercept a C-47. Furthermore, there's the radar evidence. When two planes collide in mid-air, the radar screen doesn't show a merge. It shows an explosion, a bloom of debris, multiple small returns scattering in all directions. That's what a collision looks like on radar. But that's not what the controllers saw. They saw two blips merge into one, and then the single blip continued on the unknown's original heading for a moment before fading away. That doesn't look like a crash. That looks like absorption. And here's the kicker. If Moncla crashed, fine. But what happened to the unknown target? It didn't crash. It didn't turn back. It just disappeared. The radar lost both contacts simultaneously. So where did it go? In 1968, 15 years after the incident, some aircraft wreckage was discovered on the shore of Lake Superior near Alona Bay. A USAF officer confirmed the parts were from a military jet, possibly an F-89. But no serial numbers were recovered. No definitive link to Moncla's plane was ever established. The wreckage was logged and forgotten. Apparently, in 2006, a group called the Great Lakes Dive Company released sonar images claiming they'd found the F-89 sitting upright on the lakebed with a mysterious cylindrical object nearby. It made headlines. UFO researchers went wild. But it was quickly debunked as a hoax. The company didn't exist. The images were fake. It was a publicity stunt. So what we're left with is this. On a snowy November night in 1953, two experienced military officers flew into a storm to intercept an unidentified target moving at high speed over Lake Superior. Ground radar watched them close in. The two blips merged on the screen. And then both vanished. No wreckage, no bodies, no answers, just an empty radar scope and a scrambled explanation that doesn't match the evidence. The official file is still classified as cause unknown. Moncla and Wilson are listed as missing, presumed dead. Their families never got closure. The Air Force never explained the radar anomaly. And the unknown? It was never identified. It was never found. It just flew away. Makes you wonder. The Andes Mountains. They call it the Wall of South America, a jagged spine of rock and ice stretching 4,300 miles down the western edge of the continent. Peaks that soar over 20,000 feet, glaciers, blizzards, winds so violent they can flip a plane upside down. In 1947, commercial aviation was still in its infancy, and pilots didn't have the luxury of flying over the Andes. They had to thread the needle through the peaks, navigating by dead reckoning and luck. And this is significant because one wrong turn, one miscalculation of wind or altitude, and you don't get a second chance. You hit granite at 300 miles per hour, and the mountain swallows you whole. August 2nd, 1947. Buenos Aires, Argentina. A luxury airliner sits on the tarmac preparing for departure. It's an Avro Lancastrian, a converted Lancaster bomber from World War II, stripped of its guns and bomb bays, fitted with seats and a pressurized cabin. British South American Airways operated these planes on some of the most dangerous routes in the world. And this one, registration GAGWH, had a name painted on its nose. Stardust. The flight plan was simple. Buenos Aires to Santiago, Chile. A straight shot across the Andes, about 3.5 hours. The passenger manifest included a king's messenger, a diplomatic courier carrying classified documents, 6 passengers total, plus a crew of 5. At the controls was Captain Reginald J. Cook, a decorated Royal Air Force pilot, a war hero, not a rookie. He'd flown combat missions over Germany. He knew how to handle a plane. So as a result, when Stardust took off at 1:46 p.m. local time, nobody was worried. The weather in Buenos Aires was fine. The plane climbed to 24,000 feet, well above the lower peaks, and turned west toward the Andes. The passengers settled in, wrapped in blankets, sipping oxygen through tubes to fight the thin air. The cabin was freezing. The engines roared. It was uncomfortable, but it was routine. But as they approached the mountains, the weather turned. A massive snowstorm rolled in, blanketing the peaks in thick cloud cover. Visibility dropped to 0. The crew was flying blind, navigating by instruments and dead reckoning. And here's the thing. In 1947, pilots didn't know about the jet stream. They didn't understand that high-altitude winds over the Andes could blow at over 100 miles per hour, creating a massive invisible headwind that could hold a plane back, slowing its ground speed without the pilots realizing it. Apparently, Captain Cook calculated his position based on airspeed and elapsed time. He thought he'd crossed the mountains. He thought he was over the central valley of Chile, approaching Santiago. He was confident. At 5:41 p.m., the radio operator, a man named Dennis Harmer, tapped out a message in Morse code to the Santiago control tower. The message was calm, professional. It read, ETA Santiago, 17 to 45 hours. Estimated time of arrival, 4 minutes. And then Harmer added something else, 7 letters, Morse code, transmitted loud and clear, STENDEC. The radio operator at Santiago received the transmission. He stared at the paper where he'd written the letters, Stendec. He didn't recognize it. It wasn't a standard aviation term. It wasn't a code word. It wasn't anything. He keyed his mic and asked for a repeat. Harmer tapped it out again. Faster this time, more emphatic. STENDEC. The Santiago operator, still confused, asked for clarification, and Harmer sent it a third time with absolute confidence. STENDEC. And then, silence. The frequency went dead. The plane never arrived. Now, this is important. Stardust wasn't 4 minutes from landing. It was nowhere near Santiago. Because the jet stream headwind had been pushing against the plane for the entire flight, holding it back, slowing its progress over the ground. Captain Cook thought he'd crossed the Andes. He thought he was over the valley. So he started his descent through the clouds, expecting to break through the overcast and see the lights of Santiago below. But he hadn't crossed the mountains. He was still deep in the heart of the Andes, surrounded by peaks, and as stardust descended through the storm at 300 miles per hour, it flew straight into the vertical face of Mount Tupungato, a 21,000-foot peak on the Argentine-Chilean border. The impact was catastrophic. The plane disintegrated on contact, and within seconds, a massive avalanche buried the wreckage under thousands of tons of ice and snow, hiding it from the world. For 50 years, Stardust was a ghost. Search parties scoured the Andes. Military aircraft flew grid patterns over the mountains. They found nothing. The plane had vanished without a trace. So as a result, the theories started. Some said it was sabotage. The king's messenger was carrying secrets and someone wanted them buried. Others said it was mechanical failure. And some, because of that bizarre final word, said it was something stranger. Alien abduction, a coded distress signal, a Stendek. What did it mean? The mystery became a legend. Aviation enthusiasts debated it for decades. Cryptographers tried to decode it. Linguists analyzed it. Nobody could explain it. And then, in 1998, 2 Argentine mountaineers were climbing Mount Tupungato when they spotted something strange protruding from the glacier. A Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Twisted metal. Pieces of fabric. They'd found stardust. Furthermore, in 2000, an Argentine army expedition recovered more wreckage. They found landing gear with the tires still inflated. They found human remains preserved in the ice. And they found fragments of the fuselage still bearing the registration number, GAGWH. The forensic analysis revealed what happened. Stardust had hit the mountain head-on at cruising speed. The collision triggered an instant avalanche that buried the wreckage. Over the next 5 decades, the wreckage was encased in the glacier, slowly transported downhill by the movement of the ice. In 1998, the glacier finally calved, spit the debris out at its terminus, 15,000 feet lower than the crash site. The mystery of where the plane went was solved, but the mystery of what that final word meant, that remains. So the official explanation for the crash is this. Captain Cook, flying through the storm, underestimated the strength of the jet stream headwind. He thought he'd traveled farther than he actually had. He believed he was over Santiago when he was still in the mountains. He started his descent too early, and the plane flew into Mount Tupungato. Controlled flight into terrain. CFET. Tragic, but explainable. However, the investigation was far from over. Because the crash is solved, the wreckage was found. We know how they died. But we don't know what Stendek means. And that word, those 7 letters, haunts this case. Here's the first problem. It wasn't a typo. Dennis Harmer was a highly experienced radio operator. He'd served in the war. He knew Morse code inside and out. And when Santiago asked him to repeat the message, he didn't hesitate. He tapped it out again, faster, more confidently. And then a 3rd time. That's not the behavior of someone who made a mistake. That's someone transmitting exactly what they intend to transmit. Furthermore, people have tried to decode it for decades. Some say it's an anagram for descent, that Harmer scrambled the letters in a panic. But the Morse code for Stendek bears almost no resemblance to the Morse code for descent. It's not a simple mistake. Others say it's a garbled version of the airport code for Santiago, SCTI, followed by the prosign AR, which means end of message. If you run the letters together and misinterpret the spacing, SCTI AR could theoretically sound like Stendek. That's the most plausible explanation. But even that requires assuming Harmer made a very specific spacing error while transmitting quickly, and then repeated that exact same error 3 times in a row. Is that really likely? And here's the thing that bothers me. Why would a pilot, moments before impact, calmly type out a routine sign-off? If everything was normal, if they genuinely believed they were 4 minutes from landing, why add anything to the message at all? ETA Santiago 1745 is a complete transmission. You don't need to add anything. But Harmer chose to add that word. He emphasized it. He repeated it. It meant something to him. So what was it? Was it a code word for an emergency they didn't have time to explain? Was it an abbreviation for something we've lost to history? Or And this is the disturbing possibility. Did the crew see something in those final moments that they didn't have a word for? Something outside the window in the blizzard. Something that made Harmer tap out a word that wasn't in any manual, any code book, any language. We've cracked the Enigma code. We've deciphered ancient hieroglyphics. But we cannot crack Stendek. So what we have is a plane that flew into a mountain in a snowstorm, was buried by an avalanche, and spent 50 years frozen in a glacier before the ice finally gave it back. The wreckage is scattered across a museum now. The bodies were recovered and laid to rest. The crash site is marked. The investigation is closed. But the meaning of those final 7 letters, transmitted loud and clear by a professional radio operator in the last moments before impact, died in the snow. We have the wreckage, we have the bodies, we have the Morse code recording, but we don't have the answer. Stendek, a word that doesn't exist, a message that made perfect sense to the man who sent it and no sense to anyone else. Was it a mistake? A code? A warning? Or something we're not supposed to understand? The mountain kept the plane, but it kept the secret too. Makes you wonder. The Bermuda Triangle. It's one of the most famous mysteries in the world, a patch of ocean between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, where ships and planes supposedly vanish without a trace. Books have been written about it, documentaries have been made, theories range from magnetic anomalies to underwater methane eruptions to, of course, aliens. But here's the thing, the legend didn't start with sailors' ghost stories or ancient maps. It started with this flight. And this is significant because one plane vanishing is a tragedy. 2 sister ships, 2 aircraft from the same airline, flying the same routes, vanishing in the same patch of ocean within a year of each other. That's not bad luck. That's a curse. January 17th, 1949. British South American Airways, BSAA, is already on edge. The airline is barely a few years old, and it's been plagued by accidents. But the one that haunts them is the Star Tiger. In January of 1948, exactly 1 year earlier, a BSAA Avro Tudor IV airliner called Star Tiger vanished without a trace while flying from the Azores to Bermuda. No distress call, no wreckage, no bodies, just gone. 25 passengers and 6 crew erased from the sky. So as a result, when another Tudor IV, the Star Ariel, registration G Agri, was cleared to fly the Caribbean routes, the crew and passengers had to know the history. They had to know that the sister ship to the plane they were about to board had disappeared into the same waters they were flying over. But flights don't stop because of superstition. Commerce doesn't pause for ghosts. The route for the Star Ariel that morning was simple: Bermuda to Kingston, Jamaica. A short hop, about 900 miles, roughly 2.5 hours of flight time. The plane had flown from London to Bermuda the day before without incident. The crew was experienced. Captain John Clutha McPhee, a New Zealander and former RNZAF pilot, was at the controls. He had 7 crew members with him, including a flight engineer, a radio operator, and 2 stewardesses, the glamorous Star Girls, BSAA, used to brand their luxury service. And there were 13 passengers on board, including families and business people. At 8:41 a.m. on January 17, 1949, the Star Ariel taxied down the runway at Kindley Field in Bermuda, lifted off into the morning sky, and turned south toward Jamaica. Now, this is important. The weather was perfect. Not just good for flying, perfect. Crystal clear skies, unlimited visibility, calm seas. The kind of day where you can see for miles in every direction, where the horizon is a sharp line between blue ocean and blue sky. There were no storms, no squall lines, no turbulence. The Star Tiger had vanished in rough weather. At least you could blame the storm. But the Star Ariel? This was paradise. Apparently, Captain McPhee climbed to 18,000 feet and settled into cruise. The engines were humming smoothly. The passengers were relaxed. The Star Girls were serving coffee. It was routine, boring even. At 9:32 a.m., McPhee radioed his position. I departed from Kindley Field at 8:41 a.m. My ETA at Kingston is 2:10 p.m. I flew over 150 miles south of Kindley Field at 9:32. Everything was normal. No mention of trouble. No hint of concern. Just a standard position report. 5 minutes later, at 9:37 a.m., McPhee radioed again. I was over 30 degrees north at 9:37. I am changing frequency to MRX. MRX was the call sign for Kingston Control. He was switching radio frequencies to check in with his destination. It was procedural, standard. Captain McPhee's voice was calm, matter of fact. He sounded like a guy doing his job, looking forward to landing and getting a coffee. Furthermore, he signed off from Bermuda and switched his radio to the Kingston frequency. The Bermuda controllers assumed he'd check in with Kingston any moment. They moved on to other flights, but McPhee never checked in. Kingston Control waited and waited. They tried to hail the Star aerial on the radio. No response. They waited longer, assuming maybe the crew was busy or dealing with a minor radio issue. Still nothing. So as a result, Kingston finally radioed back to Bermuda and asked, "Where's Star Ariel?" Bermuda said, "He switched to your frequency. Isn't he with you?" Kingston said, "We never heard from him." The realization set in slowly, like ice water creeping up your spine. The Star Ariel had fallen through the cracks. Bermuda thought he was talking to Kingston. Kingston thought he was still with Bermuda. And in the gap between those two assumptions, the plane had vanished. It was now 12:05 p.m., 2 hours and 28 minutes since the last contact. The Star Ariel was gone. The alarm went out. The U.S. Navy mobilized. And this wasn't just a few Coast Guard cutters. This was a task force. The battleship USS Missouri, the same ship where Japan surrendered to end World War II, was deployed as the command vessel. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, dozens of search planes. They scoured thousands of square miles of ocean, retracing the Star Ariel's flight path, searching for any sign of wreckage. The expectation was the same as it always is. Even if the plane disintegrated on impact, something floats. Seat cushions, luggage, fuel slicks, bodies, life rafts. Aviation accidents leave debris fields, always. It's a law of physics. But the searchers found nothing. No oil slick, no floating wreckage, no bodies. Not a scrap of fabric, not a single rivet. It was the Star Tiger all over again. A perfect, clean disappearance. Apparently, the silence was deafening. Investigators interviewed the ground crews. They reviewed the maintenance logs. The Star Ariel had been in perfect condition. No mechanical issues, no fuel problems. The weather was flawless. The crew was experienced. And yet, the plane had ceased to exist somewhere between Bermuda and Jamaica over calm, clear water without a single distress call. Furthermore, this disappearance was the final nail in the coffin. BSAA grounded the Tudor IV fleet. The airline's reputation was destroyed. Insurance companies refused to cover them. Passengers refused to fly with them. Within 2 years, British South American Airways collapsed and was absorbed into BOAK, which later became British Airways. The Tudor IV was retired from service and scrapped. It became known as a cursed aircraft, a flying coffin. And the legend of the Bermuda Triangle? It was born in that silence. 2 Tudor Fees, Star Tiger and Star Ariel, vanishing in the same waters a year apart without a trace. That's when people started asking, what is it about this place? So the official investigation concluded with one of the most extraordinary admissions in aviation history. The British Ministry of Civil Aviation essentially threw up their hands and wrote, "In the absence of any evidence as to the fate of Star Ariel, it is impossible to determine the cause of the accident. Some external cause may overwhelm both man and machine." Translation: we have no idea. But the mystery refused to be solved so simply. Because here's the first problem: the weather. You can blame a storm for the Star Tiger. It vanished in rough conditions, high winds, poor visibility. Maybe the pilot got disoriented. Maybe the instruments failed in the turbulence. It's tragic, but it's at least explainable. But the Star Ariel? This plane was flying in a postcard. Clear skies, calm seas, perfect visibility. You don't crash in perfect weather without sending a distress call unless something catastrophic happens instantly. And even then, most catastrophic failures give you seconds to react. Fire, structural failure, decompression. The crew has time to key the mic and yell, "Mayday!" Captain McPhee didn't. And here's the second problem: the altitude. The Star Ariel was cruising at 18,000 feet. If both engines failed simultaneously, which is statistically almost impossible, the plane could glide. A Tudor 4 has a glide ratio. McPhee could have radioed for help and set up an emergency water landing. He had time, he had training, he had a working radio. But he didn't use it. Furthermore, there's the sabotage theory. And look, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but you have to admit, two brand new airliners from the same airline, flying the same routes, vanishing in the same patch of ocean within 12 months of each other. Some investigators whispered about it. Was someone targeting BSAA? Was there something or someone on board that someone else wanted gone? The Star Tiger had carried a mysterious Mr. T, whose identity was never fully clarified. The Star Ariel had passengers too, though none as high profile. But no evidence of sabotage was ever found. No bomb fragments, no suspicious maintenance, nothing. And then there's the theory that haunts me, the design flaw. The Tudor 4 had a documented problem with its cabin heating system. The heater burned aviation fuel to generate warm air, and it was mounted right next to the hydraulic lines under the cockpit floor. Hydraulic fluid is flammable. If there was a leak, just a tiny leak, it could create a vapor, and if that vapor came into contact with the hot heater or a spark, it would explode. Instantly. A fireball tearing through the fuselage so fast the crew wouldn't have time to react. The plane would disintegrate at 18,000 feet, scattering debris over miles of ocean, where it would sink before anyone could find it. But we'll never know. Because there's no wreckage to examine, no black box to analyze, just two radio transmissions and then silence. So what we have is a plane that took off into perfect weather, flew for an hour without incident, calmly switched radio frequencies, and then ceased to exist. No distress call, no wreckage, no answers. And 1 year earlier, its sister ship, the Star Tiger, did the exact same thing in the exact same waters. Apparently, the legacy of the Star Ariel isn't the investigation or the wreckage, or even the passengers. It's the monster it created. The Bermuda Triangle legend didn't exist before these two flights. But after the Star Ariel vanished, journalists started connecting the dots. They looked at other disappearances in the area, ships, planes, even submarines. They drew a triangle on a map and said, "This place is cursed." And maybe it's not. Maybe it's just bad luck, bad weather, bad design, human error compounded by an unforgiving ocean. But the fact remains, two Tudor 4s flew into that triangle and never came out. And no one, not the Navy, not the investigators, not the families, ever found a single piece of wreckage to explain why. The ocean swallowed them whole, and it's never given them back. Makes you wonder. The year is 2014. We live in the digital age. We track everything. You can open an app on your phone and watch your pizza delivery driver navigate traffic in real time. You can see exactly where your Uber is, down to the second. We have GPS satellites orbiting the planet. We have radar stations blanketing every inch of airspace. We have transponders on every aircraft that broadcast their identity, altitude, and speed to the world. And this is significant because in this world, in this hyper-connected, hyper-surveilled age, a 640,000-pound Boeing 777 carrying 239 people should not be able to vanish. It's not just unlikely, it should be impossible. And yet, on March 8, 2014, that's exactly what happened. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, MH370, the most infamous disappearance in modern aviation history. It was supposed to be a routine red-eye flight from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia to Beijing, China, a 6-hour hop across the South China Sea. Families were flying home. Business people were heading to meetings. The plane was a Boeing 737-200ER, one of the safest, most reliable aircraft ever built. Registration 9MMRO. It had been in service for over a decade without a single major incident. At the controls was Captain Zaharieh Ahmad Shah, a 53-year-old veteran with over 18,000 flight hours. He was respected, calm, professional. He'd been flying the 777 for years. Sitting next to him was First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, 27 years old, transitioning to the 757. This was one of his final training flights before becoming a full captain. Everything about this flight was textbook, routine, boring. So as a result, when MH370 pushed back from the gate at Kuala Lumpur International Airport at 12:41 a.m. and taxied to the runway, nobody gave it a second thought. At 12:42 a.m., the Boeing 777 roared down runway 32R, lifted off into the warm, humid night, and climbed smoothly to 35,000 feet. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, calm air. The South China Sea stretched out below them, dark and endless. For the next 40 minutes, the flight proceeded exactly as planned. Captain Zaharieh and First Officer Farik communicated with Malaysian Air Traffic Control. They passed routine position reports. The passengers settled in. Some were sleeping, some were watching movies, some were reading. It was a red-eye, quiet, unremarkable. And then, at 1:19 a.m., as the plane approached the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace, First Officer Farik keyed the radio and spoke the final words anyone would ever hear from MH370. "Good night, Malaysian 370. His voice was calm, casual, almost bored. It was a standard sign-off. Lumpur radar had just instructed him to contact Ho Chi Minh City Control in Vietnam. Farik acknowledged. He said goodnight, and then he switched frequencies. But he never checked in with Ho Chi Minh City, because 90 seconds later, something happened that changed everything. At 1:21 a.m., 1 minute and 2 seconds after that polite goodnight, the transponder on MH370 was manually switched off. Not a malfunction, not a failure, manually disabled. Someone in the cockpit reached up to the overhead panel and flipped the switch. Apparently, on radar screens across Southeast Asia, the little blip labeled MH370 simply vanished, gone. Air traffic controllers in Kuala Lumpur assumed the plane had switched to Vietnamese control. Controllers in Ho Chi Minh City assumed it was still with Malaysia. And in the gap between those two assumptions, in that bureaucratic blind spot, MH370 turned around. Now, this is important. The plane didn't crash. It didn't descend. It didn't explode. It executed a sharp, deliberate left turn and flew back across the Malay Peninsula, back toward Malaysia, back the way it had come. And here's where it gets chilling. The flight path it took was surgically precise. It flew along the border between Malaysian and Thai airspace, threading the needle between two countries' radar coverage. Military radar on both sides saw the blip, but because it was on the border, each side assumed it belonged to the other country. Nobody challenged it, nobody scrambled jets. The plane was invisible in plain sight. Furthermore, this wasn't random. This was the work of someone who understood radar coverage, someone who knew where the gaps were, someone who knew how to exploit them. A master pilot. So as a result, MH370 crossed back over Malaysia, passed just south of Penang, a major city on the northwest coast, and then turned northwest, up the Strait of Malacca. And here's another eerie detail. As the plane flew over Penang, a cell tower on the ground briefly connected to First Officer Farik's phone, just for a second. The connection was too short to make a call or send a message, but it pinged. Was Farik trying to reach out? Was he trying to call for help? Or was he just sitting there, phone in his pocket while someone else flew the plane? We'll never know. Because after the plane turned northwest and left Malaysian military radar coverage, it vanished again. This time, for real. But MH370 didn't crash into the Strait of Malacca. It kept flying. And the only reason we know this is because of something called the Satellite Data Unit, the SDU. It's a system that allows the plane to communicate with satellites for in-flight internet and phone service. Even though the transponder was off, even though the plane was invisible to radar, the SDU kept sending automated handshakes to an Inmarsat satellite every hour. Little electronic pings. I'm still here. I'm still flying. Apparently, engineers at Inmarsat analyzed these pings. They looked at the frequency shift, the Doppler effect, and the time delay, and they realized something horrifying. MH370 had turned south. It had flown out over the Indian Ocean into the most remote, desolate stretch of water on the planet, and it had flown for 7 hours after vanishing from radar. 7 hours. It's not a malfunction. That's not a fire. That's a deliberate flight path. Someone, or something, was controlling that plane. Furthermore, the final ping came at 8:19 a.m., roughly 7 hours after takeoff. The engines had run out of fuel. The plane, now a 200-ton glider, began its final descent. Investigators believe it hit the water somewhere along what they call the 7th arc, a geometric arc across the southern Indian Ocean where the final satellite ping originated. The search zone covered 120,000 square kilometers of ocean, some of the deepest, roughest, most inaccessible water on Earth. Mountains, trenches, ridges. It's the kind of place where a 787 could sink to the bottom and never be found. And for years, that's exactly what happened. Nothing. No wreckage, no black boxes, no bodies, just silence. So the official theories go something like this. There was a fire on board, maybe an electrical fire, maybe a lithium battery in the cargo hold. The fire knocked out the communication systems and incapacitated the crew with smoke or hypoxia. The plane, still on autopilot, turned randomly and flew south until it ran out of fuel. A ghost flight, tragic but explainable. Or there was a catastrophic decompression. The cabin lost pressure, everyone passed out, the plane flew itself into the ocean. The end. But not so fast. Because here's the first problem, the timing. The transponder went dark at 1:21 a.m., right at the exact moment the plane was transitioning from Malaysian to Vietnamese airspace, the handoff point where no one was actively watching it. That's not a coincidence. That's not a random electrical failure. That's a calculated move. A fire doesn't wait for air traffic control handovers. A fire doesn't turn off the transponder at the most opportune moment to disappear unnoticed. And here's the second problem, the flight path. A ghost plane, a plane on autopilot with an unconscious crew, flies straight. It doesn't turn, it doesn't navigate, it doesn't thread the needle between two countries' radar coverage, but MH370 turned. It flew along waypoints. It avoided radar. Someone was flying that plane, someone who knew what they were doing. Furthermore, there's the simulator evidence. In 2016, investigators analyzed Captain Zaharieh's home flight simulator, the kind flight enthusiasts use to practice. They recovered deleted data from the hard drive, and they found something chilling, a simulated flight path that ended in fuel exhaustion over the southern Indian Ocean, the same area where MH370 is believed to have crashed. Zaharieh had practiced this exact route months before the flight. Now, does that prove he did it? No, pilots simulate all kinds of scenarios, but the coincidence is hard to ignore. And then there's the wreckage. In 2015, a piece of the plane, a flaperon, part of the wing, washed up on Réunion Island off the coast of Madagascar. Over the next few years, more debris appeared. Pieces of the interior, parts of the engine cowling, fragments of the fuselage. Forensic analysis confirmed they were from MH370. The barnacles on the wreckage even told a story. They showed the plane had been in the water for over a year before drifting across the Indian Ocean. But here's the thing. The debris showed the flaps were retracted at impact, not extended. If the crew was trying to make a controlled emergency landing, if they were trying to ditch the plane, they would have extended the flaps to slow down. But they didn't. The plane hit the water at high speed, in a steep dive with the flaps up. That's not a ditching. That's either a crash after fuel exhaustion, or someone deliberately flying the plane into the ocean. So what we have is a Boeing 787 that took off from Kuala Lumpur, said a polite "good night," turned off its transponder at the exact moment it crossed into a radar blind spot, executed a perfect U-turn, flew along international borders to avoid detection, turned south into the emptiest stretch of ocean on the planet, and flew for 7 hours in total silence before plunging into the water. Apparently, the search for MH370 became the most expensive in aviation history. Multiple countries, millions of dollars, autonomous underwater vehicles scanning the ocean floor, and they found some debris, some pieces. But the main wreckage, the black boxes, the answers, they're still down there, somewhere, waiting in the dark. We know the plane turned. We know someone was flying it. We know it flew for 7 hours, but we don't know why. Was it Captain Zaharieh? Was it a hijacker? Was it a catastrophic failure that somehow mimicked deliberate action? We'll probably never know, because the ocean keeps its secrets, and the Indian Ocean is very, very good at keeping secrets. 239 people, families, children, business people, vanished on March 8, 2014. And in an age where we can track a pizza, we still can't find a 200-foot-long airplane. Makes you wonder. The Mariana Trench. It's the deepest scar on the planet, a gash in the ocean floor that drops 36,000 feet below the surface, 7 miles straight down into crushing darkness. The pressure at the bottom is over 16,000 pounds per square inch. If you sank a steel ball down there, it would implode before it reached the bottom. If you dropped a plane into the Mariana Trench, it would fall for 7 miles and disappear into a place where no light has ever reached. And this is significant, because on March 16, 1962, Flying Tiger Line Flight 739 didn't just vanish over the Pacific Ocean, it vanished directly over the Challenger Deep, the deepest point in the Mariana Trench. If something went down there, it didn't crash. It fell into the abyss, and it's never coming back. March 16, 1962. The Vietnam War is just beginning to heat up. Officially, the United States isn't at war yet, but unofficially, American soldiers are already being deployed to Southeast Asia in growing numbers. The public doesn't know the full scale of it. The missions are classified. The flights are quiet. Flying Tiger Line wasn't a passenger airline in the traditional sense. It was a cargo and charter carrier that specialized in military contracts. And on this particular day, they were flying a Lockheed L-1049H Super Constellation, one of the most iconic airliners of the 1950s. A massive 4-engine propeller-driven beast with a distinctive triple tail and a sleek dolphin-shaped fuselage. It was designed for long-haul transoceanic flights, and it was reliable, sturdy, trusted. But this wasn't a tourist flight. The passengers weren't families on vacation. The manifest listed 93 U.S. Army Rangers, highly trained specialists in communications, electronics, and demolitions. They were heading to Saigon, Vietnam, on a classified mission, and with them were 11 civilian crew members, including the pilot, Captain Gregory P. Thomas. Now, this is important. Captain Thomas was a legend. He was 48 years old, with over 19,500 flight hours. During World War II, he'd flown Bob Hope on USO tours to entertain the troops. In 1957, he'd successfully ditched a DC-6 in Jamaica Bay without losing a single passenger. He was cool, experienced, not the kind of guy who panics. So as a result, when Flight 739 departed Travis Air Force Base in California on March 15th, hopping across the Pacific, Hawaii, Wake Island, Guam, nobody was worried. It was a long flight, but it was routine. The Super Constellation cruised smoothly. The soldiers settled in. Some slept, some played cards, some stared out the windows at the endless blue ocean below. At 12:57 GMT on March 16th, the plane departed Andersen Air Force Base in Guam, refueled and ready for the final leg to Clark Air Base in the Philippines. It was a clear night. The weather was perfect. Captain Thomas radioed his position at 2:22 p.m. local time. He reported they were 280 miles west of Guam, cruising at 18,000 feet. Everything was normal. The transmission was calm, professional, routine. That was the last anyone ever heard from Flight 739. The next scheduled position report was due at 3:30 p.m. Controllers in the Philippines waited. The frequency stayed silent. They tried to hail the plane. No response. They waited longer, assuming maybe the radio was acting up. Still nothing. By 4:00 p.m., alarm bells were ringing. Flight 739 was overdue, and it had gone completely silent. But approximately 1 hour earlier, right around the time the plane should have been making that 3:30 report, something happened in the dark Pacific sky. Apparently, the crew of a Liberian-flagged supertanker called the SSTL. Linson was sailing through the Philippine Sea that afternoon. It was a massive oil tanker, and the crew, mostly Italian sailors, was on deck, going about their work. The ocean was calm, the sky was clear. It was a quiet, unremarkable day. And then, at approximately 3:30 p.m., they saw it. A massive pulse of light in the sky. Not lightning, not a flare, a bright, intense flash, white at the center with a reddish-orange periphery. The sailors stopped what they were doing and stared. One of them described it later as a bright light strong enough to light the ship's decks, in broad daylight. Furthermore, they saw two objects falling, two separate burning masses trailing fire and smoke, plummeting toward the ocean at different speeds. One was faster, one was slower. They fell for several seconds, long enough for the crew to track them, and then they hit the water miles away from the ship. The radar operator in the tanker's bridge tracked one of the falling objects on his scope for about 10 seconds before it disappeared below the horizon and vanished. The captain of the TL Linson immediately recorded the coordinates and radioed a distress report. He believed he'd just witnessed a plane explode in mid-air. But by the time search and rescue teams could be mobilized, hours had passed, and the ocean is a big place. The U.S. military launched one of the largest search operations in Pacific history. This wasn't just a commercial airliner that had gone missing. This was a plane carrying 93 American soldiers heading to a war zone. The political and military implications were enormous. So as a result, the response was massive. Over 300 personnel were deployed, 48 aircraft, search planes, helicopters, maritime patrol bombers, 8 ships including destroyers and Coast Guard cutters. They combed over 200 square miles of ocean, retracing the flight path, focusing on the coordinates reported by the TL Linson. They searched for 8 days straight. Now, here's the thing. When a plane explodes in mid-air, it creates a debris field that's impossible to miss. The explosion tears the fuselage apart, and everything inside gets ejected. Seats, luggage, paper, life vests, bodies. Fuel creates an oil slick that can spread for miles and linger for days. Even if the heavy parts, the engines, the wings, sink immediately, the light stuff floats. Always. It's basic physics. But the search teams found nothing. No oil slick. No floating wreckage, no seat cushions, no life vests, no bodies, not a single screw. The ocean was clean, pristine, as if the plane had never existed. Apparently, some searchers reported seeing small patches of oil, but when they investigated, it turned out to be natural seepage or bilge discharge from passing ships. Nothing definitively linked to Flight 739. The Super Constellation, a 120-foot-long, 50-ton aircraft carrying over 100 people, had vanished without leaving a trace. So the official conclusion, based on the testimony of the TL Linson crew, was this. Flight 739 suffered a catastrophic mid-air explosion. The cause was undetermined, but the theories ranged from mechanical failure, possibly a propeller breaking loose and tearing through the fuselage, to sabotage. The plane broke apart in the sky, and the wreckage sank in the deep waters of the Philippine Sea, possibly over the Mariana Trench, where it would be unrecoverable. Yet, the real answers lay buried much deeper. Because here's the first problem. You can't have it both ways. If the plane exploded in mid-air, as the tanker crew claims they witnessed, there should be a massive debris field, thousands of pieces of floating wreckage scattered across miles of ocean, paper, fabric, foam, plastic, all of it lighter than water. It floats for days. The search teams arrived within hours and found nothing. How do you have an explosion and a pristine ocean? And here's the second problem. If the plane didn't explode, if it ditched intact or suffered a catastrophic structural failure and hit the water in one piece, then where's the oil slick? A super constellation carries thousands of gallons of fuel. Even if the plane sank quickly, fuel would leak out as it went down. You'd have a visible slick on the surface. But there was none. Furthermore, there's the sabotage theory. And this one haunts investigators to this day. Flight 739 was carrying 93 elite soldiers, communication specialists, demolition experts, heading to Vietnam. The plane had stopped in Guam to refuel. And apparently, during that stopover, the aircraft was left unattended in a dimly lit, unsecured area of the airfield for over 90 minutes. That's a massive security lapse. Anyone with access to the tarmac could have approached the plane, could have planted something in the wheel well, the cargo hold, the engine nacelle. And here's the kicker. On the same day, Flight 739 vanished. Another Flying Tiger Line super constellation, carrying military cargo, crashed and burned in the Aleutian Islands. Two planes from the same airline, flying military charters, lost on the same day. The official explanation was coincidence, but some investigators whispered about a coordinated attack, Soviet sabotage, a message sent during the Cold War, but no proof was ever found. No one was ever arrested. The theory remains just that, a theory. And then there's the tanker testimony itself. Some skeptics have questioned whether the crew of the T.L. Linson actually saw a plane explode, or if they witnessed a large meteor breaking apart in the atmosphere. Meteors can create brilliant flashes of light. They can break into multiple pieces. But here's the problem. Meteors fall fast. They streak across the sky in seconds. The tanker crew described watching two distinct burning objects fall for several seconds, long enough to track them with the naked eye and on radar. That's not a meteor. That's something mechanical, something with weight, something man-made. So what we have is a military charter flight carrying 93 American soldiers that took off from Guam into a clear Pacific night, reported its position 280 miles out, and then ceased to exist. A tanker crew claims they saw it explode in a brilliant flash of light, two burning objects falling into the ocean. But an 8-day search by over 300 personnel across 200,000 square miles of ocean found absolutely nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no oil, nothing. Apparently, until Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 vanished in 2014, Flying Tiger Line Flight 739 held the record for the largest aviation disappearance in history, with 0 wreckage recovered. 107 people, 93 soldiers, 11 crew members, and 3 South Vietnamese passengers gone, erased from the sky. And here's the most tragic part. Because the incident occurred before the official start of the Vietnam War, before Congress declared combat operations, the names of those 93 soldiers are not listed on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. They're not honored on the wall. They exist in a bureaucratic limbo. Casualties of a war that hadn't officially started, lost on a flight that officially never crashed. The ocean over the Mariana Trench is 7 miles deep. If Flight 739 went down there, it's sitting at the bottom of the deepest place on Earth, crushed by pressure, buried in silt, in total darkness. And it's never coming back. Makes you wonder. The Martin M130 flying boat. These weren't just planes. They were flying hotels. Luxury liners of the sky. They didn't land on runways. They landed on water. They had lounges, dining rooms, sleeping berths, stewards in white jackets serving 5-course meals on china plates. Flying a Pan Am Clipper in the 1930s wasn't just travel. It was an event. The rich and famous paid top dollar to cross the Pacific in style, island hopping from San Francisco to Manila in a week-long journey that felt more like a cruise than a flight. And this is significant because when one of these giants vanished, it wasn't just an aviation accident. It was like the Titanic disappearing. These planes were symbols of American power, American innovation, American reach across the Pacific. They were unsinkable. Except, of course, they weren't. July 29, 1938. The Hawaii Clipper, Pan Am Flight 229, registration NC Metavat 4, sits in the calm waters of Opera Harbor in Guam. It's a humid tropical morning. The four massive Pratt & Whitney engines are warming up, their propellers slicing through the thick air. The plane is a sleek silvery beast, 147 feet long, with sponsons jutting out from the hull like stubby wings to keep it stable on the water. On board are 15 people, 9 crew members, pilots, a flight engineer, a radio operator, and stewards, and 6 passengers. But this wasn't just any passenger flight. One of those passengers was a man named Hua Sun Choi, a Chinese-American restaurateur from New Jersey, and he was carrying something extremely valuable. Now, this is important. China was at war with Japan. The Second Sino-Japanese War was raging, and the Chinese nationalist government, the Kuomintang, was desperate for funds to keep fighting. So as a result, Hua Sun Choi was acting as a courier. He was transporting $3 million in U.S. gold certificates, essentially bonds backed by gold, to support the Chinese war effort. $3 million in 1938. That's roughly $60 million in today's money. It was a fortune. And it was sitting in the cargo hold of the Hawaii Clipper, bound for Manila and then onward to China. Apparently, the crew knew about the cargo, Pan Am knew, the insurance companies knew, and intelligence agencies on both sides of the Pacific probably knew. This wasn't a secret flight, but it was a high-stakes one. The geopolitical tension was thick. Japanese naval vessels were prowling the Western Pacific. American interests and Japanese ambitions were colliding, and the Hawaii Clipper was flying right through the middle of it. At 11:39 a.m., Captain Leo Terletsky, a veteran master of ocean flying boats, known for his cautious, methodical approach, gave the signal. The engines roared. The massive flying boat skimmed across the harbor, lifted off the water, and climbed into the tropical sky. The flight plan was straightforward: Guam to Manila, Philippines, a 1,589-mile journey across the open Pacific, about 12 and a half hours of flight time. The weather was decent, visibility was good. It was supposed to be routine. For the first 3 hours, everything went according to plan. The Hawaii Clipper droned westward at 9,100 feet, cruising smoothly over the endless blue expanse of the Philippine Sea. The radio operator, William McCarty, sent routine position reports back to Pan Am ground stations in Guam and the Philippines. Ops normal. The passengers were settled in. The stewards were serving lunch. Captain Terletsky was calm, confident. But as the flight progressed, the weather began to change. The plane entered a zone of unsettled air, what the crew described as a sandwich of clouds. There was a solid layer of stratocumulus clouds above them at 9,200 feet and another layer of cumulus clouds below them at the same altitude. The Hawaii Clipper was flying in a narrow corridor of clear air between 2 cloud decks, with no visual reference to the horizon or the sun. It was like flying through a tunnel. Furthermore, rain began to pelt the windscreen, and with the rain came something that pilots of the era dreaded: rain static. It's an electrical phenomenon. When an aircraft flies through charged precipitation, static electricity builds up on the fuselage and discharges through the radio antennas, creating a deafening crackling noise that drowns out all communication. Radio Officer McCarty was struggling to maintain contact with the ground. At 12:11 p.m., roughly 4 hours into the flight, McCarty keyed the mic and sent a message to the Pan Am station at Panay in the Philippines. He reported their position, approximately 565 miles from the Philippine coast. He mentioned the rough weather, the clouds, the rain. And then he added, "Stand by 1 minute, having trouble with rain static." His voice was calm, professional. It was a routine weather report. There was no panic, no distress, just a heads up that the radio was acting up. Apparently, the ground station at Panay waited. They prepared to send back the terminal weather forecast for Manila, but when they tried to transmit, there was no response. They called again. Silence. They kept trying for the next several minutes, broadcasting on all assigned frequencies. The Hawaii Clipper never answered. At 12:13 p.m., the radio went completely dead, and the Hawaii Clipper, with 15 souls, $3 million in gold certificates, and 138 pounds of mail and freight, vanished. The alarm went out immediately. Pan Am activated their emergency protocols. The U.S. Navy mobilized ships and aircraft. The U.S. Army Air Corps joined the search. This wasn't just a missing airliner. This was a missing treasure ship. The gold certificates alone made this a priority. So as a result, on July 30th, 1938, the day after the disappearance, a U.S. Army transport ship called the USIT Meigs was steaming through the search zone when the crew spotted something, a large oil slick on the surface of the water. It was approximately 1,500 feet in circumference, a massive pool of oily sheen spreading across the calm sea. The ship's crew lowered a boat and took samples. They smelled it. It was pungent, high octane, the kind of oil used in aircraft engines. Furthermore, chemical analysis back on land concluded the oil was consistent with the type used in the Pratt & Whitney engines of the Martin M130. The investigators were confident they'd found the crash site. The Hawaii Clipper was somewhere below that slick resting on the ocean floor. But here's where it gets strange. They searched that area for days, dragged the bottom, sent divers down where the water was shallow enough. They looked for floating debris, seat cushions, luggage, life vests, pieces of the fuselage. The Martin M130 was a flying boat. It was designed to float. Even if it crashed, it shouldn't just sink like a stone. The hull was divided into watertight compartments. There were buoyant materials everywhere: wood, fabric, foam. Something should have floated, but they found nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no gold. Just that oil slick, spreading and dissipating on the surface, and then nothing. The ocean was empty. So the official conclusion from Pan Am and the U.S. Navy was this: the Hawaii Clipper encountered severe weather and mechanical failure, possibly an engine failure or structural damage. The plane crashed into the sea, broke apart on impact, and sank in deep water. The oil slick confirmed the location. The lack of debris was unfortunate, but not unprecedented. Sometimes the ocean just swallows everything, but the case was far from closed. Because here's the first problem. A flying boat is specifically designed not to sink immediately. The Martin M130 had a boat-shaped hull with sealed compartments. Even if one section flooded, the rest should stay afloat, at least long enough for debris to scatter. When planes crash into water, they don't vanish cleanly. They break into thousands of pieces: plywood panels, fabric from the seats, cork life vests, wooden crates, luggage, bodies. Something always floats. But the Hawaii Clipper left nothing except oil. How? And here's the second problem: the timing and the cargo. In 1938, Japan and China were at war, and the Hawaii Clipper was flying through waters patrolled by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The plane was carrying $3 million in gold certificates destined for the Chinese nationalist government, Japan's enemy. Furthermore, there were unconfirmed reports that Japanese naval vessels had been spotted in the area around the time of the disappearance. So, the theory emerged: the Hawaii Clipper was intercepted, either boarded in mid-flight by a Japanese submarine crew after a forced water landing, or shot down and then approached by a Japanese vessel. The gold was seized. The passengers and crew were taken prisoner, or worse, and the plane was scuttled, sunk deliberately to hide the evidence of an act of piracy. Apparently, there were persistent rumors, never verified, that American POWs held in Japanese camps during World War II claimed to have seen crew members from the Hawaii Clipper, men who said they'd been captured in 1938. But these accounts were anecdotal, secondhand. No names were ever confirmed. No survivors ever came forward after the war. The rumors faded into legend. And then there's the anomaly of the oil slick itself. Yes, the oil was consistent with aircraft engine oil, but in 1938, laboratory analysis was primitive. they couldn't definitively rule out that the oil came from a passing ship's bilge discharge or a natural seep from the ocean floor. The slick was 28 nautical miles south of the Clipper's last reported position, a drift that could be explained by ocean currents, but it raises the question, if the plane crashed where the oil was found, why was it so far off course? So what we have is a luxury flying boat, a symbol of American technological dominance, that took off from Guam on a clear morning, flew into rough weather, radioed a routine message about rain static, and then ceased to exist. A massive oil slick was found, but no wreckage, no bodies, no gold, just an empty ocean and 15 people who vanished into the Philippine Sea. Apparently, to this day, the Hawaii Clipper is the only Pan Am flying boat ever lost at sea that was never found. Pan Am operated dozens of Clippers across the Pacific for years. They had accidents, they had crashes, but every other wreck was located. Bodies were recovered, investigations were completed. The Hawaii Clipper is the exception, the ghost, and the gold, $3 million in U.S. gold certificates, never recovered, never cashed. It's either sitting in a crate at the bottom of the Pacific, or it was plucked from the wreckage by hands that were never supposed to touch it. Some say the ocean keeps its secrets. Others say the Hawaii Clipper wasn't claimed by the ocean. It was claimed by something with a flag, a motive, and a reason to make 15 people disappear without a trace. Makes you wonder. The Boeing 377 Stratocruiser. This wasn't just an airplane. This was the Titanic of the skies, a double-decker luxury liner with a pressurized cabin, plush reclining seats, and this is the part people loved, a spiral staircase leading down to a lower-deck cocktail lounge. Passengers could sip martinis at 20,000 feet while crossing the Pacific. It was glamorous, it was opulent, it was the peak of the golden age of aviation. And this is significant because when one of these machines went down, it didn't just kill people, it shattered the illusion of safety. Flying was supposed to be elegant, civilized, safe. The Stratocruiser was supposed to be the proof. But on November 8, 1957, Pan Am Flight 7 taught the world a darker lesson. Luxury doesn't protect you from the abyss. November 8, 1957, San Francisco International Airport. The evening is cool and clear. Pan Am Flight. Romance of the Skies, registration N90944, sits on the tarmac, gleaming under the terminal lights. It's a scheduled flight to Honolulu, a 10-hour hop across the Pacific. The passenger manifest is filled with the kind of people you'd expect on a luxury flight. Business people, honeymooners, a few celebrities, 36 passengers total, plus 8 crew members. At the controls is Captain Gordon H. Brown, a senior Pan Am pilot with thousands of hours of experience. Next to him is First Officer William Wygant. In the cabin, the flight attendants, including a purser named Eugene Crosthwaite, prepare to serve dinner and drinks once the plane reaches cruising altitude. Everything is routine, professional. The passengers board, settle into their seats, and the Stratocruiser taxis to the runway. So as a result, at 8:51 p.m. Pacific time, Romance of the Skies roars down the runway, lifts off into the night, and turns west toward Hawaii. The weather along the route is good. Clear skies, light winds. The forecast for Honolulu is perfect. This is supposed to be a smooth, boring flight, the kind of flight where passengers fall asleep halfway through and wake up to palm trees and sunshine. For the first few hours, it is. Flight 7 climbs to its cruising altitude of 10,000 feet and settles into the long, dark crossing. The passengers eat dinner. Some head downstairs to the lounge for a drink. The engines hum steadily. The stars are bright above the endless black ocean below. Apparently, the flight checks in regularly with ground stations in San Francisco and Honolulu. At 5:04 p.m. Honolulu time, the plane is now on Hawaiian time, Captain Brown radios a routine position report. He's at the equitime point, the halfway mark, the point of no return. From here, it's closer to keep going to Honolulu than to turn back to San Francisco. Everything is normal. Fuel is good. Weather is clear. No issues. That was the last time anyone heard from Romance of the Skies. The next scheduled check-in never came. Ground controllers in Honolulu tried to hail the plane. Silence. They tried again. Nothing. The frequency was dead. The alarm went out immediately. Pan Am activated their emergency protocols. The U.S. Navy scrambled ships and aircraft. The aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea steamed toward the last known position of Flight 7 and launched search planes to sweep the ocean. They were looking for wreckage, survivors, anything. For 6 days, they found nothing. The Pacific is vast, and the search area was massive. But on November 14th, nearly a week after the disappearance, a Navy patrol plane spotted something, debris floating on the surface roughly 1,000 miles northeast of Honolulu. Furthermore, over the next few hours, search crews recovered pieces of wreckage, seat cushions, fragments of cabin interior, charred insulation, and bodies. 19 bodies in total floating in life vests scattered across miles of ocean. Now, this is important. The wreckage was found 90 miles north of the flight's planned route, 90 miles off course. That's not a small deviation. That's not turbulence pushing you slightly off track. That's a deliberate turn or a navigational error so severe it shouldn't happen to an experienced crew. Captain Brown had flown this route dozens of times. He knew the way to Honolulu like the back of his hand. So why was the plane 90 miles north? And here's another strange detail. The debris showed signs of fire. Some of the floating wreckage, pieces of cabin insulation, fabric, was charred, burned. The edges were blackened. This wasn't fire damage from hitting the water. This was fire above the waterline, meaning the plane had caught fire while it was still in the air. The recovery of the bodies provided the most chilling clues. 19 people were pulled from the ocean. 14 of them were wearing life vests. Let that sink in. 14 passengers and crew had time to put on their life vests. This wasn't a sudden catastrophic explosion. This wasn't a mid-air breakup that killed everyone instantly. The people on board knew something was wrong. They had time to react. They had time to don their vests, brace for impact, and prepare to ditch. But here's the thing. Despite wearing life vests, the bodies showed massive trauma. Multiple fractures, internal injuries, the kind of damage consistent with a high-speed, uncontrolled impact with the water, not a controlled ditching. So they had time to prepare, but the plane still hit the ocean hard. Why? If the pilots had time to alert the passengers, why didn't they pull off a survivable water landing? Furthermore, investigators noted the watches on the victims' wrists. They were stopped. Water damage had frozen the mechanisms, but they weren't all stopped at the same time. Some showed 5:27 p.m., some showed 5:26 p.m. The times were clustered around a 23-minute window after the last radio contact. This suggested the event, whatever it was, happened roughly 20 minutes after Captain Brown's final check-in. But the most damning piece of evidence came from the autopsies. So the official investigation began. The wreckage was analyzed, the maintenance logs were reviewed, and the initial theory was straightforward: mechanical failure. The Boeing 377 Stratocruiser was notorious for propeller problems. It used hollow steel Hamilton Standard propellers, and they had a nasty habit of shedding blades or overspeeding, running away, which could tear an engine off the wing or send a blade through the fuselage like a giant knife. If a propeller blade broke off and punctured the cabin, it could cause rapid decompression, fire, or structural failure. However, the investigation was far from over. Because when the coroner's office examined the recovered bodies, they found something horrifying. Elevated levels of carbon monoxide in the victims' blood and tissues, not just trace amounts, massive lethal levels. These people had been breathing carbon monoxide, CO, for an extended period before they died. Now, here's the thing about carbon monoxide. It's a silent killer. It's colorless, odorless, tasteless. You don't know you're breathing it until you start feeling dizzy, confused, weak. And if the concentration is high enough, it incapacitates you. You lose motor control. You can't think clearly. You pass out. And if you're breathing it long enough, it kills you. So the passengers and crew of Flight 7 were being poisoned in the air, slowly. insidiously. And this explains a lot. It explains why Captain Brown didn't radio a distress call. He may have been too confused, too incapacitated by CO poisoning to realize how bad things were. It explains why the plane was 90 miles off course, a hypoxic poisoned pilot making navigational errors. It explains why, despite having time to put on life vests, the passengers couldn't execute a controlled ditching. The pilots were dying in their seats. But here's the big question. Where did the carbon monoxide come from? Apparently, there was no evidence of a major in-flight fire. Yes, some wreckage showed charring, but it was localized, small scale, not a raging inferno that would have filled the cabin with smoke and CO. So if it wasn't a fire, what was it? And that's where the investigation took a dark turn. Investigators started looking at the people on board, and one name kept coming up: Purser Eugene Crosthwaite. Crosthwaite was a senior flight attendant, a purser, which meant he was in charge of the cabin crew. But apparently, he had a troubled history with Pan Am. He'd been passed over for promotions. He had grievances. He was known to be disgruntled. And in the weeks before the flight, he'd done something unusual. He'd purchased a massive life insurance policy and changed his will, making his wife the beneficiary. Furthermore, there was another passenger on board who raised red flags: William Harrison Payne. A former Navy frogman and explosives expert, Payne was heavily in debt, and just before boarding Flight 7, he'd purchased 3 separate flight insurance policies totaling $125,000, over $1.3 million in today's money, with double indemnity for accidental death. His body was never recovered. So the theory emerged: sabotage. Either Crosthwaite or Payne, or both, deliberately caused the disaster. Maybe Crosthwaite tampered with the cabin heating or ventilation system, introducing carbon monoxide into the air. Maybe Payne planted an incendiary device or chemical accelerant designed to generate CO without creating an obvious fire. The goal: kill everyone on board, make it look like an accident, and cash in on the insurance. But here's the problem. No bomb was ever found, no chemical residue, no definitive proof. Just elevated CO levels in the bodies, charred wreckage, and 2 men with motives who are now at the bottom of the Pacific. So what we have is a luxury airliner, the romance of the skies, that took off on a clear November night, flew halfway across the Pacific, veered 90 miles off course, and plunged into the ocean, killing all 44 people on board. 19 bodies were recovered, 14 were wearing life vests, meaning they knew the end was coming, and the autopsies revealed they'd been poisoned by carbon monoxide before they ever hit the water. Apparently, the official probable cause was listed as an emergency of unknown origin. That's it. The investigation couldn't definitively say what happened. Was it mechanical failure, sabotage, a fire that left almost no trace? We'll never know. Because the wreckage is scattered across the ocean floor, and the 2 prime suspects, Crosthwaite and Payne, are down there with it. The Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, the plane with the cocktail lounge, the symbol of luxury, was quietly retired from service a few years later. The era of the flying boat lounge was over. Pan Am moved on to jets, but the mystery of Flight 7 never went away. 44 people flew into the dark over the Pacific. They had time to put on their life vests, they had time to say goodbye, but they didn't have time to be saved, and the ocean swallowed them along with the truth. Makes you wonder. The Ortig Prize. $25,000, a fortune in 1927, to the first person to fly non-stop between New York and Paris, or Paris to New York. Either direction, it didn't matter. The challenge was simple: cross the Atlantic Ocean in an airplane without stopping, no ship to refuel on, no island to rest at, just you, your plane, and 3,600 miles of cold, dark water. Everyone knows who won the Ortig Prize: Charles Lindbergh. The Lone Eagle, the American hero who took off from New York on May 20th, 1927, in a little silver plane called the Spirit of St. Louis and landed in Paris 33 hours later to a crowd of 150,000 screaming fans. Lindbergh became an instant legend. His face was on every newspaper, ticker tape parades, book deals. He was the man who conquered the Atlantic. But here's the thing almost nobody knows. Lindbergh wasn't the first to try, and he wasn't even the second. 12 days before Lindbergh took off, two French World War I heroes climbed into a white biplane in Paris and disappeared into the western sky, trying to beat him to the prize. And this is significant because history is written by the victors. Lindbergh succeeded, so he's the one we remember. But the two Frenchmen? They vanished. And their story, the mystery of what happened to them, is one of the greatest unsolved enigmas in aviation history. May 8, 1927. Le Bourget Field, just outside Paris. The morning air is cool and damp. A crowd is gathered on the tarmac staring at a strange, beautiful aircraft painted stark white. It's a Levasseur PL-8 biplane, a custom-built machine designed specifically for this flight, and painted on the fuselage in bold letters is its name, L'Oiseau Blanc, the White Bird. At the controls are two men, Charles Nungesser, the pilot, a 35-year-old flying ace with 43 confirmed kills during the war. He was reckless, fearless, the kind of guy who once crashed 17 times and just kept flying. His face was scarred, his body was broken from years of combat and crashes, but he was a national hero, a legend, and next to him the navigator, François Colli, a 46-year-old veteran, calm and methodical. He'd lost his right eye in the war and wore a signature black eye patch. He was a master of celestial navigation, using the stars, the sun, and a sextant to calculate their position over the ocean. If anyone could guide them across the Atlantic, it was Colli. So as a result, the French public was confident. Nungesser and Colli weren't just pilots, they were warriors, survivors, celebrities. If anyone could beat the Americans to the prize, it was them. But there was a problem. The plane was heavy. To cross the Atlantic, they needed to carry 1,000 gallons of fuel, over 6,000 pounds. The White Bird was dangerously overloaded, and to make matters worse, Nungesser made a controversial decision. To save weight, they would jettison the landing gear after takeoff. The wheels would drop away, lightening the plane, improving aerodynamics. The plan was to belly land on the water in New York Harbor when they arrived. It was risky, insane even, but it was their only shot. At 5:17 a.m., the engines roared to life. The White Bird lumbered down the runway, struggling under the weight of the fuel. It barely cleared the trees at the end of the field. The crowd held its breath. And then, moments after takeoff, Nungesser pulled a lever. The landing gear detached and fell away, tumbling to the ground below. The wheels and struts were later recovered and are now displayed in the French Air and Space Museum in Paris. They're the only undisputed artifacts of the flight. Apparently, the White Bird climbed slowly into the morning mist, turned west, and disappeared over the English Channel. Escort planes followed for a short while, but eventually they peeled away. Nungesser and Colli were alone, heading into the unknown. For the next several hours, the world waited. Radio stations in France, England, and the United States tracked the flight as best they could. Ships at sea were alerted to watch for a white biplane. Crowds began gathering in New York, expecting to see the French heroes arrive. Apparently at 10 a.m., the White Bird was spotted over Ireland, near the towns of Dungarvan and Carrigaholt. Multiple witnesses saw the white plane flying west low over the coast. It was still on course, still flying strong. That was the last verified sighting of the White Bird by European observers. After that, silence. The plane entered the void. No ships reported seeing it over the Atlantic. No radio contact, because remember, to save weight, Nungesser had removed the radio. They were flying blind and mute, with nothing but Colli's navigation skills and their fuel supply to guide them. Furthermore, the world waited. And waited. May 8th passed, then May 9th, then May 10th. No sign of the White Bird, no telegram from New York, no wreckage spotted. By May 11th, the French government quietly issued a statement. Nungesser and Colli were presumed lost at sea. The assumption was that they'd crashed into the Atlantic either due to weather, mechanical failure, or fuel exhaustion. So as a result, 12 days later, on May the 20th, 1927, Charles Lindbergh took off from New York. He flew east, the opposite direction, and landed in Paris on May 21st. He became the hero. He won the prize. And the White Bird? It became a footnote, a tragic failure. The French heroes who almost made it but didn't. But the mystery refused to be solved so simply. Because here's where the story gets weird. On May 9th, 1927, the day after the White Bird took off from Paris, residents in Newfoundland and Maine started reporting something strange. They heard an airplane, overhead, in the fog. Now, this is important. In 1927, airplanes were rare, especially in rural Maine and Newfoundland. You didn't just casually hear a plane flying over your house. So when multiple people, fishermen, loggers, townspeople, reported hearing a loud, sputtering engine overhead, they remembered it. They talked about it. Furthermore, some of these witnesses described seeing a white plane with what looked like a broken or damaged wing, circling in the fog before disappearing into the wilderness. One fisherman near Round Lake, Maine, claimed he heard a crash, an impact in the forest, followed by silence. If these reports are true, and investigators have found them credible enough to take seriously, it means the White Bird didn't crash in the Atlantic. It means Nungesser and Colli successfully crossed the ocean. They made it to North America, but instead of landing in New York Harbor as planned, they overshot their target, got lost in the fog, ran out of fuel, and crashed somewhere in the dense forests of Maine or Newfoundland. Apparently, in 1933, 6 years after the disappearance, a story broke in a French newspaper. It claimed that 2 skeletons and wreckage from a white airplane had been found in the wilderness of Newfoundland, but Canadian authorities never confirmed it. The story faded. If the wreckage existed, it was lost again. And then, in the 1980s, a search expedition called TIGAR, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, began investigating the Maine theory. They interviewed descendants of the original witnesses. They combed through historical records, and they found something tantalizing. In 1933, a woodsman reportedly discovered a large aircraft engine mounted in trees in the Maine wilderness, as if the plane had crashed and the engine had been caught by the branches. But the woodsman didn't have a camera. He didn't take the engine. He just noted the location and left. And when researchers tried to find the site decades later, it was gone, lost to time, swallowed by the forest. Furthermore, in 1948, a piece of white wreckage, painted fabric and wood, was found in Gull Pond, Newfoundland. Analysis was inconclusive. It could have been from a 1920s-era aircraft, but without serial numbers or definitive markers, they couldn't prove it was the White Bird. So here's what we're left with. Credible witness testimony from May 9, 1927, describing a white plane over Maine, a fisherman who heard a crash, a woodsman who found an engine, and decades of searches that have found just enough to keep the mystery alive, but never enough to solve it. So what we have is this. 2 French war heroes took off from Paris on May 8, 1927, attempting to cross the Atlantic and claim the Orteig Prize. They were seen over Ireland, and then they vanished. The official story is that they crashed into the ocean and drowned. But witnesses in North America, thousands of miles from where they were supposed to crash, reported seeing and hearing a white plane on May 9th. If those witnesses are right, it means Nungesser and Colli didn't fail. They succeeded. They crossed the Atlantic before Lindbergh, but they didn't make it to the finish line. Apparently, the leading theory among researchers is this. The White Bird successfully crossed the ocean, but became disoriented in thick fog over the North American coast. They couldn't see the ground. They couldn't see New York. Colli, the navigator, was relying on dead reckoning and celestial navigation, but the fog made it impossible to take accurate readings. They circled, searching for a landmark, burning fuel. and eventually the engine sputtered and died. The plane glided down into the dense wilderness of Maine, a forest so thick, so remote, that the wreckage could rot away in 50 years and never be found. The fabric and wood would decompose. The only thing left would be the heavy engine, buried in mud or tangled in trees. Furthermore, if the white bird is out there, if it's lying at the bottom of a lake in Maine or buried in the soil of a forgotten clearing, it means history got it wrong. It means two French heroes beat Lindbergh by 12 days. They just didn't live to tell the tale. Charles Lindbergh became a legend, Nungesser and Colley became ghosts, the white bird became a mystery. And somewhere, maybe in the cold waters of the Atlantic, maybe in the green forests of Maine, the truth is waiting. Makes you wonder. December 5th, 1945. World War II is over, the boys are coming home, the celebrations are winding down, the Pacific Theater is closed, the European front is silent. After 6 years of war, the world is finally at peace. But here's the cruel irony. Some men survived the war, survived the bombs, the bullets, the kamikaze attacks, only to vanish on a routine training flight in peacetime. And this is significant because December 5th, 1945 is the day the legend of the Bermuda Triangle was truly born. Not by sailors' ghost stories or ancient maps, but by 5 U.S. Navy torpedo bombers that took off from Florida on a clear afternoon and never came back. Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station, Florida. 2:10 p.m. The sun is high. The weather is decent, some scattered clouds, a bit of wind, but nothing dangerous. On the tarmac sit 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, massive single-engine warplanes designed to hunt submarines and sink ships. These aren't trainers, these are combat aircraft, heavy, powerful, built to take punishment. The flight is designated Flight 19. 14 men total, 5 pilots, 9 crew members. Most of them are students, young officers learning navigation over open water. But leading the formation is a man who shouldn't need training. Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, a 28-year-old combat veteran with over 2,500 flight hours. Taylor flew in the Pacific during the war. He survived combat missions over Japanese-held territory. He was experienced, confident, and skilled. So as a result, when Flight 19 taxied to the runway at 2:10 p.m. for a routine training exercise called Navigation Problem Number 1, nobody was worried. The mission was simple, a triangular route over the Atlantic, fly east for 56 miles to Hen and Chicken Shoals, drop practice bombs on the target, turn north and fly for 73 miles, turn southwest and fly back to base. Total flight time, about 2 hours, a milk run, boring, routine. The kind of flight you could do in your sleep. Apparently, the flight took off on schedule. The 5 Avengers climbed into formation and turned east, thundering out over the turquoise waters of the Bahamas. The weather was clear. The ocean sparkled below them. At 2:30 p.m., they reached the target zone and dropped their dummy bombs. Everything was going exactly according to plan. And then, Lieutenant Taylor made a turn that would doom them all. At approximately 3:45 p.m., about an hour and a half into the flight, Lieutenant Taylor radioed the control tower at Fort Lauderdale. His voice was tense, confused. "Both my compasses are out. I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale. I'm overland, but it's broken. I'm sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down." Now, this is important. Taylor believed he was over the Florida Keys, the chain of islands that stretches south from the tip of Florida into the Gulf of Mexico. If you're over the Keys and you want to get back to Fort Lauderdale, you fly north. Simple. But here's the problem. Taylor wasn't over the Keys. He was over the Bahamas, the chain of islands that stretches east of Florida into the Atlantic Ocean. The two island chains look similar from the air. Both are flat, surrounded by shallow turquoise water, dotted with coral reefs. But they're in opposite directions. Furthermore, the tower tried to help. They asked Taylor for his position. They asked him to describe what he was seeing. But Taylor was adamant. He was sure he was in the Keys. And so, he made a fatal decision. he ordered the flight to turn northeast, thinking that would take them back to the Florida mainland. But since he was actually over the Bahamas, flying northeast took them away from Florida, out into the open Atlantic, further and further from safety with every passing minute. Apparently, the student pilots in the formation knew something was wrong. Radio transmissions recovered later show that some of them were questioning Taylor's navigation. One voice, believed to be a student, was heard saying, "Damn it, if we could just fly west, we would get home. What's west? If we just fly west, we'll hit Florida." He was right. If they had turned west, directly west, they would have hit the Florida coast within 20 minutes. But Taylor ignored the advice. He was the senior officer. He was in command. And military discipline meant the students had to follow orders even if they believed those orders were wrong. Furthermore, at one point during the confusion, a civilian flight instructor named Lieutenant Robert Cox heard Flight 19's distress calls on his radio. Cox was flying nearby and offered to guide them home. He radioed Taylor directly. "What's your trouble?" Taylor responded, his voice strained. "Both my compasses are out, and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale." Cox said, "I can fly to you. What's your position? I'll guide you in." And then Taylor said something chilling. "Don't come after me." Cox tried again. He asked for coordinates. He offered help. But Taylor refused. He told Cox to stay away. And Cox, confused but respecting the order, flew back to base alone. So as a result, Flight 19 continued flying northeast, into the dark, into the unknown, and with every minute that passed, their fuel gauges crept lower. By 5:30 p.m., the sun was setting. The scattered clouds that had been harmless in the afternoon were now building into a storm. The wind picked up, rain began to fall, and Flight 19 was running out of fuel. Apparently, the tower at Fort Lauderdale was now in full emergency mode. They'd been trying to guide Taylor home for over 2 hours, but his transmissions were weak, fragmented, increasingly desperate. At one point, ground controllers managed to get a radio direction fix on Flight 19's position. The fix placed them north of the Bahamas, deep over the Atlantic, far from land. Furthermore, another radio transmission was intercepted. Whether it was from Taylor or one of the students is unclear, but the voice said something that has haunted researchers ever since. "Everything looks wrong. Even the ocean doesn't look right." What does that mean? Pilots know what the ocean looks like. You've got blue water, white waves, maybe some clouds. But even the ocean doesn't look right? What did he see? By 7:00 p.m., it was fully dark. The storm was intensifying, and Lieutenant Taylor made his final transmission. "All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." And then, silence. The radio went dead. Flight 19 was gone. But the tragedy wasn't over. So as a result, the Navy scrambled a rescue mission. A PBM Mariner flying boat, a large twin-engine patrol aircraft with a crew of 13, took off from Banana River Naval Air Station at 7:27 p.m. Its mission, find Flight 19, drop flares, guide them home, or at least mark their position if they'd ditched in the water. At 7:50 p.m., the Mariner sent a routine position report. And then, nothing. The plane vanished from radar. 23 minutes after takeoff, it was gone. Furthermore, a merchant ship, the SS Gaines Mills, was sailing in the area. The crew reported seeing a massive explosion in the sky at approximately 7:50 p.m., a huge ball of orange fire falling into the ocean. They steamed toward the location and found a wide slick of oil and floating debris. But no survivors. The Mariner had exploded in midair. The PBM Mariner was known as a flying gas tank. It was notoriously prone to fuel vapor leaks. A single spark, from static electricity, a loose wire, anything, could ignite the vapors and blow the plane apart. That's almost certainly what happened. But the timing, vanishing at the exact moment it was searching for Flight 19, fed the growing legend. 27 men, gone, in one night. So the official Navy investigation concluded this. Lieutenant Charles Taylor got lost due to compass failure. He became disoriented, flew the wrong direction, ran out of fuel, and ditched in the Atlantic. The 5 Avengers sank quickly in rough seas, and no wreckage was ever recovered because they went down in deep water. Tragic, but explainable. Pilot error. The end, but not so fast. Because here's the first problem: the refusal. When Lieutenant Robert Cox, an experienced pilot who was in the air and nearby, offered to fly to Flight 19 and guide them home, Taylor said, "Don't come after me." Why? If you're lost, if your compasses are out, if you're running low on fuel, you want help. You don't refuse rescue. So why did Taylor push him away? Was he embarrassed? Ashamed that a combat veteran was getting lost on a training run? Or was he seeing something, experiencing something that he didn't want Cox to witness? And here's the second problem: the ocean. That one transmission. Everything looks wrong. Even the ocean doesn't look right. Pilots are trained observers. They know what water looks like: blue, gray, green in shallow areas, white foam on the waves. But what could make the ocean look wrong? Was it a trick of the light, the storm, or something else? Furthermore, there's the question of the students. These were combat aircraft. Each Avenger had a radio. If the students believed Taylor was flying them to their deaths, if they heard the argument, if they knew flying west would save them, why didn't a single one break formation? Why didn't one pilot key his mic and radio the tower directly? "We're over the Bahamas, not the Keys. Send help." Did they stay out of military discipline, loyalty, or were they afraid of something? And then there's the legend, the part that makes this case the cornerstone of Bermuda Triangle lore. Over the years, stories emerged, unverified but persistent, that Taylor said things like, "We are entering white water, nothing seems right," or that he reported seeing strange lights. The Navy denies these quotes appear in the official transcripts. Researchers say they're fabrications, added later by sensationalist authors like Vincent Gaddis to sell books about the paranormal. But the fact remains: 5 planes and 14 men vanished without a trace. No wreckage, no oil slick, no bodies. The Navy searched for 5 days, covering 250,000 square miles of ocean. They found nothing. So what we have is this. On a clear December afternoon in 1945, 5 U.S. Navy torpedo bombers took off on a routine training flight. The leader, a combat veteran with thousands of hours of experience, became convinced his compasses were broken and flew his squadron out into the Atlantic. He refused help. He ignored advice from his own students. He said the ocean didn't look right. And then he and 14 men vanished into the dark. And when a rescue plane went looking for them, it exploded in midair 23 minutes into the search, killing another 13 men. 27 souls lost. In one night, in an area of ocean that would become synonymous with mystery and disappearance. Apparently, the Navy originally blamed Taylor. The accident report listed the cause as pilot error, but Taylor's mother fought the ruling. She said her son was a hero, not a fool. And eventually, the Navy changed the official cause to TIUS, cause unknown. They couldn't, or wouldn't, say what really happened. They say if you fly over the Bahamas at night, you can sometimes hear a faint radio transmission crackling through the static. A voice from 1945, still calling out into the void, "Don't come after me," makes you wonder. The year is 1937. The world was bigger then. There was no GPS, no satellite phones, no weather radar. Flying across an ocean wasn't just difficult, it was an act of faith. You calculated your course with a compass and a sextant. You navigated by the stars, the sun, and dead reckoning. You flew for hours over empty water, praying your math was right, praying the wind didn't push you off course, praying you'd see land before your fuel ran out. And this is significant, because when Amelia Earhart set out to become the first woman to fly around the world, she wasn't just trying to set a record. She was trying to conquer the planet itself. To prove that a woman, armed with skill, courage, and a Lockheed Electra, could do what men said was impossible. She'd already made history in 1932 by becoming the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. But this was her masterpiece. The ultimate flight. July the 2nd, 1937, Lae, New Guinea. The sun is just beginning to rise over the jungle airstrip. A silver twin-engine Lockheed Electra 10E sits on the tarmac, its fuselage gleaming in the early morning light. The plane is loaded, overloaded really, with fuel. Every available inch of space has been converted into fuel tanks. The Electra is essentially a flying bomb, carrying enough gasoline to fly 2,156 miles across the Pacific to a tiny speck of coral called Howland Island. Howland Island. It's barely half a mile wide, a flat, barren dot in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Finding it from the air is like throwing a dart at a map while blindfolded. But if Amelia and her navigator, Fred Noonan, can reach Howland, they'll refuel and continue on to Hawaii, then California. The circumnavigation will be complete. She'll be a legend. So as a result, at 10 a.m. local time, Amelia climbs into the cockpit. Fred Noonan, a former Pan Am navigator, considered one of the best in the world, settles into his seat behind her with his charts, sextant, and chronometer. Noonan is an expert. He's navigated countless flights across the Pacific. But there are whispers, rumors, that he's been drinking heavily in recent weeks. Some say he's been spotted drunk in bars in Lae. Whether those rumors are true or just gossip, we'll never know. But they haunt the case. Apparently, the Electra taxis down the rough dirt runway. It's heavy, dangerously heavy. The plane struggles to lift off, barely clearing the trees at the end of the strip. But it makes it. The Electra climbs slowly into the tropical sky, turns east, and disappears over the endless blue horizon. The next 18 hours would be the most critical of Amelia Earhart's life. And the last. Waiting at Howland Island is the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca. The ship is stationed offshore, tasked with guiding Amelia in via radio and sending up smoke signals to mark the island's location. The crew is ready. The radio operators are standing by. All Amelia has to do is find them. But as the hours tick by, it becomes clear that something is wrong. Apparently, as the Electra approaches the target area, somewhere around 7:42 a.m. Howland time, the Itasca begins receiving radio transmissions from Amelia. But there's a problem. It's one-way communication. The Itasca can hear Amelia loud and clear, strength 5 signal, perfectly audible. But Amelia can't hear them. She's transmitting, but she's not receiving. It's a radio mismatch, possibly a frequency issue, possibly a malfunctioning antenna on the Electra. Either way, she's flying blind, unable to hear the guidance being sent to her. Furthermore, the transmissions Amelia sends are increasingly frantic. At 7:42 a.m., she radios, "We must be on you, but we cannot see you. Fuel is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio. We are flying at 1,000 feet. The Itasca responds immediately, sending her a bearing, telling her to home in on their signal. But she doesn't hear them. She keeps transmitting, but there's no acknowledgement. She's talking into the void. At 8:43 a.m., over an hour later, Amelia sends her final confirmed transmission. Her voice is strained, urgent. "We are on the line 157 3.37. We'll repeat message. We will repeat this message on 62.110 kilocycles. Wait." And then we are running north and south. Now, this is important. The line 157 337 is a line of position, a navigational concept. It means Noonan took a celestial shot with his sextant and calculated that they were somewhere along a line that runs northwest to southeast through the area where Howland Island is located. But they can't pinpoint their exact location on that line. So Amelia is flying back and forth along the line, searching for the island visually. So as a result, the Itasca crew listens as Amelia's voice fades in and out. They try to respond. They send bearings. They fire flares. They pump out black smoke to make the ship more visible. But she never acknowledges. She never says she sees them. And then, at 8:43 a.m., the radio goes silent. No final mayday. No distress call, just static. And Amelia Earhart the most famous woman in the world, vanished. The alarm went out immediately. The U.S. Navy launched the most expensive air and sea search in history up to that point, $4 million in 1937 dollars, roughly $85 million today. The aircraft carrier USS Lexington steamed toward the search area, launching dozens of aircraft to sweep the ocean. Battleships, destroyers, Coast Guard cutters, over 60 ships and 100 aircraft combed 250,000 square miles of the Pacific. They searched for 16 days. They found nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no life raft, no bodies. The ocean was empty. On July 19, 1937, the search was called off. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were declared lost at sea. Apparently, President Franklin D. Roosevelt personally authorized the search. The U.S. government spared no expense, but the Pacific is vast. Howland Island is tiny. And if Amelia and Fred went down in deep water, if the plane sank quickly, there would be nothing to find. The official conclusion was simple. They ran out of fuel, ditched in the ocean, and drowned. A tragic accident. Yet, the real answers lay buried much deeper. Because here's the first problem: the post-crash radio signals. For days after Amelia vanished, July 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, radio operators across the Pacific, and even some in the United States, reported hearing distress calls on Amelia's frequency, 3105 kHz. The transmissions were faint, broken, sometimes garbled, but some operators swore they heard a woman's voice. Some claimed they heard the call letters CAC, Amelia's official call sign. One operator in Hawaii reported hearing, "Water, water, Fred is hurt." Now, here's the thing. The Electra's radio system required engine power to transmit. If the plane was in the water, the engines would be flooded, dead. The radio wouldn't work. But if the plane was on land, if it had crash-landed on a reef or an island, the crew could run one engine intermittently to charge the battery and send distress calls. Furthermore, Pan Am, the airline with the most expertise in Pacific operations, analyzed the radio signals and concluded that some of them were likely genuine, not all. Some were hoaxes, some were misidentified signals from other sources, but some were credible. If those signals were real, it means Amelia and Fred didn't drown in the ocean. It means they survived the initial crash and were transmitting for help. But from where? And that's where Gardner Island comes in. Gardner Island, now called Nikumaroro, is a small, uninhabited coral atoll about 350 miles southeast of Howland Island. It sits almost perfectly on Amelia's line of position, the 157-337 line she mentioned in her final transmission. If Amelia and Fred overshot Howland and flew south along that line, searching for land, they would have eventually seen Gardner Island. Furthermore, Gardner has a flat reef on its western shore. At low tide, the reef is exposed, hard, flat, smooth. You could land a plane on it. At high tide, the reef floods. If Amelia landed the Electra on the reef at low tide, she and Fred could have survived, climbed out of the plane, and begun sending radio distress calls. But as the days passed and the tides came in, the plane would have been battered by the waves, eventually breaking apart and sliding off the reef into deep water. So as a result, in 1940, 3 years after Amelia vanished, British colonial officers landed on Gardner Island to assess it for potential settlement. And they found something strange: a partial human skeleton near a campsite on the island's southern shore. The bones were sent to Fiji, where a British doctor named D.W. Hoodless examined them. He measured the bones and concluded they belonged to a male, approximately 5'5" tall. The bones were then lost, discarded or misplaced, the records unclear. For decades, that was the end of the story. The bones were dismissed as belonging to a castaway from some other forgotten shipwreck. But in 1998, forensic anthropologists re-examined Hoodless's original measurements using modern techniques. Dr. Richard Jantz, a forensic expert, used a software program called 4Disc to analyze the bone dimensions. His conclusion? The skeleton was 99% likely to be a tall female of European descent, a perfect match for Amelia Earhart, who was 5'7" to 5'8". Furthermore, TICHAR, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, has conducted multiple expeditions to Nikumaroro since the 1990s, and they've found artifacts that are hard to ignore. A piece of plexiglass with rivet holes that matches the window configuration of a Lockheed Electra. A woman's compact mirror from the 1930s found near the skeleton site. A zipper pull and buttons consistent with 1930s flight clothing. A jar of anti-freckle cream, specifically Dr. C.H. Barry's freckle ointment. Amelia was known to use this product. It's mentioned in her personal effects. Apparently, in 2024, a deep-sea sonar expedition claimed to have found a plane-shaped object on the ocean floor near Howland Island. But follow-up analysis by geologists suggested it was likely a rock formation. No physical wreckage has been retrieved. The Gardner Island theory remains the most evidence-rich alternative to the crash and sink hypothesis. So what we have is this. On July 2, 1937, Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan took off from New Guinea on the most dangerous leg of their round-the-world flight. They flew for 18 hours over empty ocean, searching for a half-mile-wide island they couldn't find. At 8:43 a.m., Amelia transmitted that she was flying north and south along a line of position, a line that runs directly through Gardner Island. And then the radio went silent. For days afterward, radio operators heard distress signals, a woman's voice. Water, water, calls for help. But the U.S. Navy searched the wrong area. They focused on the waters around Howland Island. They never looked at Gardner. Apparently, 3 years later, bones were found on Gardner Island, bones that modern forensic science says were likely hers, and artifacts, personal items, pieces of a plane, that match the Electra. If the evidence is right, it means Amelia didn't drown in the ocean. She didn't die on impact. She survived the crash, landed on a reef, and spent her final days as a castaway on a barren coral island, sending distress calls that no one answered, waiting for rescue that never came. Until the heat, the thirst, and the isolation took her. She wanted to be the first woman to fly around the world. Instead, she became the world's most famous ghost. A legend who vanished into the Pacific and left behind only fragments, a piece of plexiglass, a compact mirror, a jar of freckle cream, and bones that were lost before anyone realized whose they were. The ocean keeps its secrets, but sometimes, just sometimes, the islands give them back. Makes you wonder. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoy our content.